Jackson Hale walked into that saloon with blood on his knuckles and snow in his hair, and he didn't wait for the room to quiet down. He just said it loud and flat, and without a single ounce of shame, "I need a wife before sunrise." Nobody laughed at first. They just stared. Because a man like Jackson Hale didn't say things he didn't mean. And those words, 7 of them, were about to change 2 children's lives forever. If this story already has you subscribed to this channel, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Jackson Hale hadn't been inside a saloon in 4 years. He didn't drink anymore. Hadn't since the winter his brother died in a snowdrift 3 ridges north of Aspen Creek, and nobody came to help because nobody knew where to look. After that, Jackson stopped going places where men wasted time and money and breath on things that didn't matter. He lived alone in a cabin 2,000 feet above the town of Aspen Ridge, where the pines grew so thick in summer that noon looked like dusk, and where the only voices he heard for weeks at a time were the wind and the creek and his own thoughts, which were not always kind company. He'd come down the mountain that evening for flour and salt and a new file for his blade. Simple things. Things a man needed to survive. He hadn't planned to walk into the dusty lantern. He hadn't planned to say what he said. But plans had stopped meaning much to Jackson Hale 3 weeks ago on the morning he rode into Blackstone Canyon and found a wagon that had rolled off the ridge road and 2 people inside it who were already past saving. A man and a woman, mid-30s both of them. The woman had one arm stretched out like she'd been reaching for something in her last moment. Jackson had looked at that arm for a long time before he understood what she'd been reaching for. Because behind the wagon, tucked into a shallow cut in the rock wall, probably pushed there by the man before the wagon went over, there were 2 children. A boy, maybe 9 years old, dark-haired jaw set so hard it looked like it might crack. He had a hunting knife in his hand, and he was holding it with both fists, and his eyes said very clearly that he would use it if he had to. And a girl, younger, 6, maybe 7. She was curled behind her brother's legs with her arms wrapped around his calf, and she wasn't crying anymore. That was the part that hit Jackson hardest. She wasn't crying. She'd already cried herself dry. He'd dismounted slowly. He'd held up both hands. He'd said, "I'm not going to hurt you." And the boy had said nothing, just kept holding the knife. And Jackson had thought, good kid. The kind of kid who protects what he loves even when he's terrified. Jackson respected that more than almost anything. Their names were Luke and Molly Hale. Same last name as Jackson, and that coincidence had been the thing that finally made the boy lower the knife just a fraction, like maybe the universe had sent someone they were allowed to trust. They weren't relations. Jackson had no relations left. But a name was a name, and sometimes that was enough to start with. He'd brought them home. He'd fed them, given them the only real bed in the cabin, slept on the floor himself for 3 weeks without complaint. He'd ridden into town twice for supplies and kept his head down and told nobody about the children because he hadn't yet figured out what came next. He thought maybe if he kept quiet long enough, something would clarify itself. What clarified itself instead was Deputy Roy Casper, who showed up at Jackson's door 4 days ago with a document from the Territorial Authority and a look on his face that was half apology and half cowardice. Roy Casper wasn't a bad man. Jackson had known him 15 years. He was the kind of man who followed rules because it was easier than questioning them, which was most men if you were honest about it. "Jackson," Roy had said, holding the document out, "there's been a report. A report. Someone in town saw you bringing children up the mountain. Word got back to the county office. They sent this down." Jackson had read the document on the porch while Roy waited with his hat in his hands. It wasn't long. Legal language had a way of being brief when it wanted to take something from you. The territory of Colorado did not permit unmarried men living without female supervision to serve as legal guardians of minor children. Period. No exceptions listed. A representative of the county would arrive at dawn in 4 days' time to assess the situation. If the situation had not been corrected specifically, if no woman of good standing was present as a spouse or legal guardian, the children would be removed and transported to the Territorial Orphan House in Denver. Denver was 3 days' ride. Jackson had been there once. It was a loud, gray, grinding place. The orphan house he'd heard about in passing, overcrowded, understaffed, the kind of place where children disappeared into the machinery of charity and came out the other side changed in ways nobody ever bothered to describe. He'd handed the document back to Roy. Roy had said, "I'm sorry, Jackson. I truly am." Jackson had said nothing. He'd gone back inside and stood in the middle of the cabin and listened to Luke and Molly arguing quietly over a picture book he'd bought in town. Molly insisting on making up her own words for the story, because she didn't know how to read yet. Luke correcting her with the particular mix of exasperation and patience that only older siblings managed. And Jackson had stood there for a long time listening. 4 days had seemed like enough time to figure something out. It had not been enough time. He'd spent 2 days riding to every homestead within 20 miles hat in hand, asking women he barely knew if they would consider a practical arrangement. He'd tried to explain it plainly. No romance, no expectation, just a legal necessity, a roof over their heads, food on the table. He'd ask nothing else of them. He'd gotten doors closed in his face. One woman had sent her husband out with a rifle. One widow he'd respected had listened for 10 full minutes and then said very gently, "Jackson, I can't risk my reputation for a situation I didn't create." And he'd understood that even as it had landed like a stone in his chest. He'd ridden back to the cabin by the 3rd day and looked at the children sleeping and thought about Denver, about what it meant, about the way Molly had started calling him Mr. Jackson instead of just staring at him in silence, about the way Luke last Tuesday had gotten up before dawn and gone to the barn on his own and fed the horses without being asked, and then came back inside and sat down to breakfast with something in his expression that might, if Jackson was very careful not to name it, have been the beginning of something like trust. He could not let Denver happen. He had 1 night left, so he'd come down the mountain. He'd walked into the Dusty Lantern Saloon at 7:30 in the evening on a Tuesday in July, and the room had been full. Miners, ranchers, a few traveling men, a card game in the back. The summer heat sat heavy in the air, even this late. The bartender, a thick-armed man named Clifton, who Jackson had nodded to maybe 6 times in the last decade, had looked up when Jackson walked in and clearly decided, based on Jackson's expression, not to say anything unnecessary. Jackson had stood in the middle of that room. He'd said it. "I need a wife before sunrise." Silence. Real silence. The kind that had weight and texture. The card game stopped. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. A man near the door actually turned to look behind him, as if maybe the words had been meant for someone else. Then someone laughed. Not kindly. It was a miner near the bar, red-faced, large, the kind of man who'd learned early in life that laughing at things was easier than understanding them. "A wife," he said, slow and amused, turning on his stool. "Before sunrise. You out of your mind, Hale?" Jackson looked at him. The man stopped laughing. "There are 2 children," Jackson said to the room, not to any one person. "Orphaned. They've been living up at my place for 3 weeks. The county is sending someone at dawn to take them to Denver unless I'm married by then. I'm not interested in romance. I'm not interested in complications. I need a woman who's willing to stand in front of a justice of the peace tonight and sign her name next to mine. I will treat her with respect. I will give her a roof. I will not make demands on her person. That is what I'm offering. That's all I'm offering." He paused. "If anyone here knows a woman who might consider it, I'd take it as a kindness if you'd point me in her direction." Another beat of silence. Then the room exhaled and began talking again all at once, and none of it was useful. Jackson stood and listened to it, the muttering, the head shaking, the low jokes he could half hear from the card table in the back. He'd expected this. He wasn't sure what else he'd expected, but he'd expected this. Clifton behind the bar set a glass of water down in front of him. Not whiskey, water, which was either a commentary or a kindness, and Jackson chose to take it as the latter. He stood at that bar for 40 minutes. A few men approached him, one to tell him he was insane, one to offer something that wasn't what Jackson had asked for at all, and which Jackson shut down with 3 words and a look. and one older rancher who'd said quietly that he admired Jackson's commitment to those children and wished he could help, and then shook his hand and walked away. That last one had been the hardest moment, oddly. More than the door in his face. More than the rifle. He was about to leave. He'd begun to accept in the flat, quiet part of himself where he stored things he couldn't fix that this wasn't going to work. That he would go back up the mountain tonight and pack the children's things. They had almost nothing, which made the packing worse to think about, and ride down to meet the county representative in the morning and find a way to explain to Luke and Molly that the world had rules, and sometimes the rules were wrong, and sometimes wrong things happened anyway. He'd straightened up from the bar. He'd reached for his hat. That was when he heard the chair. It wasn't loud, just the scrape of wood on wood from the far side of the room, near the window. He hadn't paid much attention to the table by the window because it had held only one person, a woman sitting alone, which was unusual enough that he'd clocked her when he came in and then deliberately not stared the way he'd been raised. She stood up. She was on the slight side, though. The way she stood made her seem taller than she was. Dark hair pinned back, a few strands loose from what must have been a long day. A plain dress, practical, not the kind women wore to be noticed. She had a book on the table in front of her, still open, which meant she'd been reading here, reading alone in a saloon, which Jackson found unexpectedly interesting, and her finger was still marking the page, like she wasn't entirely sure yet that she was getting up for good. She looked at him. He looked at her. The room, which had been buzzing back to life, went quiet again. She walked toward him. Not fast, not slow. The walk of someone who'd made a decision and was carrying it carefully like a lamp in wind. She stopped about 4 feet away. Her eyes were dark and steady, and they took him in without flinching. His height, the state of him, the desperation he'd been trying not to let show, and probably had anyway. "You said 2 children," she said. Her voice was even, controlled, but not cold. There was something underneath it that he couldn't name yet. "Yes, ma'am, a boy and a girl, 9 and 6. And you've had them for 3 weeks. Yes. Alone. Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, nobody breathed. "How are they?" she asked. That stopped him. Out of everything she might have said. "How desperate are you? What do I get out of this? Why should I believe you?" She had asked how the children were. He thought about the honest answer. "Scared," he said. "Doing their best not to show it. The boy's protecting his sister like it's the only job he's got left in the world. The girl, she's trying to be brave, but she wakes up crying most nights. They're—" He stopped, started again. "They're good kids. They don't deserve what happened to them, and they don't deserve Denver." Something shifted in her face. Small. He almost missed it. "What's your name?" she asked. "Jackson Hale." "Eleanor Whitmore," she said, not extending a hand, just giving him the name like it was something solid, something he could hold on to. "Mrs. or Miss?" "Widow. 2 years." He nodded. She looked at him for another long moment, and he could see her thinking. He didn't try to rush it. Whatever calculation she was running, she had every right to finish it. "If I agree," she said, "I have conditions." "Name them. I'll be treated as a partner, not a prop, not a convenience, not something you pulled out of a saloon because you had no other options." She said that last part without any particular heat, just accuracy. "I understand what tonight is. I understand this isn't a love story, but inside that house I am a person with standing. Not less than you, not below the children, equal." "Agreed. The children come first, both of us. If there's ever a question about what either of us wants versus what's best for those children, the children win. I'd have it no other way. And if this arrangement ever needs to end," she paused, "we discuss it like adults, and we protect the children from the disruption as best we can." "Fair," Jackson said. She studied him another moment. Then she looked around the room at all the men who'd been watching this like it was entertainment. Mouths slightly open, cups forgotten in their hands, and there was something in her expression that wasn't contempt, but was adjacent to it. the look of a woman who had lived in this world long enough to know exactly what these men thought of her walking up to a stranger and agreeing to marry him in a saloon. She looked back at Jackson. "All right," she said. "Let's go find a justice of the peace." The room erupted, not in celebration, in something more complicated than that. Men talking over each other, one woman near the door. The proprietor's wife, Jackson thought, making a noise of either disapproval or astonishment. The red-faced miner who'd laughed first, now shaking his head with the slow authority of a man who believed women should not make large decisions quickly. Jackson didn't hear most of it. He put on his hat. He held the door open for Eleanor Whitmore. She walked through it without looking back. Outside, the July night was warm and full of stars, and the street was still and silent in the way that small towns got late in summer. That particular quiet that felt like the whole world holding its breath between one thing and the next. She stopped on the boardwalk. "I should get my things from the boarding house," she said. "I have a bag. It won't take long." "I'll wait," he said. She turned and looked at him. In the lamplight from the saloon window, her face was clearer, tired around the eyes, something in the set of her mouth that suggested a long time of carrying things without asking for help. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said. It wasn't unkind. It was just honest. "Few nights," he admitted. "How far is your cabin?" 2 hours up the ridge, on horseback." "We should hurry then." She looked at the sky, calculating. "If we're going to find Judge Harcourt at this hour and get back before dawn with any margin." Jackson nodded. She started toward the boarding house. He fell into step beside her. They walked in silence for a moment, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was just new. Two strangers measuring the distance between where they were and where they were about to be. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Eleanor," she said. "If we're going to be married before midnight, you might as well." "Eleanor." He tried it. It sat all right. "Thank you." She didn't answer for a beat. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when those children are still in that cabin tomorrow morning." He thought about Luke, about the way the boy had looked at him this afternoon, when Jackson had said he was going into town, had looked at him with those careful dark eyes, and said with a flatness that broke something in Jackson's chest, "You coming back?" As if he'd already learned that adults sometimes said things and then didn't do them. Jackson had said yes, and meant it with everything he had. He meant to make it true. "Fair enough," he said. "Let's move then." They moved. Judge Harcourt answered the door in his nightshirt and the expression of a man being asked to do something unreasonable, which was accurate. He was 70-ish, irritable by constitution, and had been the territorial justice of the peace for Aspen Ridge for 11 years. He'd married people under unusual circumstances before. He'd married a man on his deathbed once. He'd married 2 people in the middle of a rainstorm when the church roof had gone. He was not entirely without flexibility. He was, however, without patience for being woken at 9 in the evening. "Hail," he said, squinting. "What in the who is this woman?" "Eleanor Whitmore, widow of Charles Whitmore, late of Dunn Creek. I need you to marry us, Judge. Tonight. It's urgent." Harcourt looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at him with the particular calm of someone who has already decided that other people's opinions of their choices are not relevant to the choices. "Is this," Harcourt said very carefully, "voluntary on your part?" "Mrs. Whitmore." "Entirely," she said. "No coercion. No, he hasn't made any sort of—" "Judge Harcourt," Eleanor said with the patience of a woman who had been underestimated so many times that she'd built a system for managing it. "I am a widow of 2 years, formerly a schoolteacher, and I am capable of determining what I agree to and why." Mr. Hale asked. "I considered it. I agreed. If you need to add anything to that process, I suggest you add speed." Harcourt looked at her for another moment. Then, against what appeared to be his better judgment, he stepped back and let them in. It took 11 minutes. Jackson knew because he watched the clock on the judge's mantelpiece the entire time, the slow crawl of the minute hand, the weight of each second. The vows were short. The legal language was shorter. Harcourt's wife, roused from bed by the noise, and standing in the doorway in a wrapper with her gray hair loose, served as witness, and had the expression of a woman who had seen stranger things, and had made her peace with the world's strangeness. When it was done, Harcourt said, "Congratulations, I suppose," in a tone that conveyed moderate skepticism about the institution of marriage in general, and this one in particular. He signed the document. Eleanor signed it. Jackson signed it. Eleanor folded her copy precisely and put it in her bag. They were outside again in 12 minutes. She had one bag. She'd said it wouldn't take long, and she'd been right. It was a single worn carpet bag that she carried herself and didn't ask him to take. He offered anyway. She declined. "I'm capable," she said, not sharp, just stating fact. They reached the horses. Jackson's roan steady and mountain-bred, and a smaller gray that Eleanor had apparently kept at the livery stable, which told him something about her. A woman who kept her own horse was a woman who planned for her own exits. He respected that. They rode out of Aspen Ridge at 9:30, the summer night, wrapped around them like something warm, and waiting the ridge road rising ahead into dark pine and scattered starlight. They didn't speak much for the first hour. The road required attention in the dark, and both of them seemed to understand that there would be time for words later, and that right now the most important thing was to move. About an hour up the mountain, Eleanor said, "Tell me about them." He didn't have to ask who. "Luke," he said, "doesn't trust easy. He's been the man of that family for 3 weeks, and he knows it, and he takes it seriously. He's going to test you. He'll be watching everything you do to see if you're real or if you're just something else that's going to leave. And Molly. Molly is—" He thought about her. The way she'd put a wildflower on the windowsill last week, carefully like it was an offering. The way she'd asked him once in a very small voice if her mama could see her from heaven, and he'd said yes, which was not something he believed particularly, but which was absolutely the right thing to say. "Molly is tender," he said. "She gets hurt easy, but she's not fragile. There's something steady in her underneath. She's going to be all right. She needs to know the floor's not going to fall out again." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did you lose someone?" she asked. He glanced at her. She was watching the trail ahead, her profile clear in the moonlight, not looking at him. "How do you mean?" "The way you talk about those children," she said. "The way you understand what they need. That's not something a person figures out from nothing. Someone taught you that, or you learned it the hard way." He kept his eyes on the road. "My wife," he said, "and our son, 7 years ago. Fever went through this county like a fire. Half the mountain got sick, most recovered." "I'm sorry," she said. It was quiet and direct, and she didn't add anything to it. He'd been offered condolences 100 times in 7 years, and most of them had required him to manage the person offering them to say thank you. "I'm fine." It was a long time ago until they felt better. Eleanor Whitmore offered her sorry, like it was just the truth, and left him room to do whatever he wanted with it. "You," he said. "Your husband." "Typhoid," she said. "He was a good man. We had a real partnership. I've missed the partnership more than I've allowed myself to say in general." "Why'd you agree tonight?" he asked. The real reason. She was quiet long enough that he thought maybe he'd asked too directly. "I watched those men in that saloon," she said finally. "I heard what you said, and I watched those men laugh or look away or not move an inch. And I thought about 2 children on a mountain who haven't done anything wrong and who are going to wake up tomorrow and have their lives taken apart again." She paused. "I've been teaching children for 12 years. I know what it does to them when the ground disappears. I know what it costs." Another pause. "And I thought I have one thing those men don't have. I have a choice. And I can use it, or I can sit here with my book and go back to my room at the boarding house and tell myself it wasn't my problem." Jackson said nothing. "I've told myself things weren't my problem before," she said. "It doesn't sit well." The cabin came into view through the pines sometime around midnight. A light was burning in the window low, the last of a lamp that had been left on. Jackson had left it for himself, not thinking about what it would look like from the outside, but from here, coming up the mountain path in the dark, it looked like what Luke and Molly had probably needed to believe in for 3 weeks. Something waiting for them. Eleanor reined in beside him and looked at it. "It's a good cabin," she said. "It's plain," he said. Plain as honest. She swung down from her horse, stood for a moment. He watched her look at that lit window the way he'd been looking at it for 3 weeks, like it was a question she'd been trying to answer. "What time does the county man come?" she asked. "Dawn, 5, maybe 6. Then we have a few hours." She picked up her bag. "Let's go inside." They went in quietly, so as not to wake the children. The cabin was still and warm, with summer night air coming through the single open window, and Jackson moved around the small space in the practiced way of a man who knew every inch of it in the dark. He lit the lamp on the table low. He found an extra blanket on the shelf, and then from behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area, they heard a small sound. Not crying, more like a shifting, and then a careful silence that was too deliberate to be sleep. Jackson and Eleanor looked at each other. Luke was awake, had probably been awake for hours listening for hoofbeats. Jackson moved to the curtain. He didn't pull it back. He just said quietly, "I'm back." A pause. "You said you would be," came Luke's voice. Flat, controlled, trying very hard not to sound like relief. "I did," Jackson said. "I'm here." Another pause. "Is she with you?" Luke asked. Jackson looked back at Eleanor. She was standing by the table lamp, casting a warm, unsteady light across her face, her bag still in her hand. She nodded once, a small, precise nod that said, "Go ahead, this is your moment, handle it right." "Yes," Jackson said. "Her name is Eleanor. She's going to be staying with us." "Why?" "So the county man has no reason to take you anywhere tomorrow." Long silence from behind the curtain. Then, "Is she nice?" Jackson looked at Eleanor again. Something in his expression must have asked the question. She took one quiet step toward the curtain. "I'm a fair person," she said, and her voice was steady and unhurried, the voice of someone who'd talked to children for 12 years and knew that they heard tone before they heard words. "I'm not your mother, and I know that. I'm not going to try to be. But I'm not going anywhere. And I know how to make good biscuits in the morning, and if you want to talk to me, I'll listen. And if you don't, that's all right too." Silence. Then softer from closer to the floor, Molly's voice thick with sleep. "Does she have soft hands?" Eleanor blinked. Jackson saw it, a sudden thing quickly controlled. She crouched down next to the curtain. "I don't know," she said, honest. "I've done a lot of work in my life. Let me know what you think in the morning." And from behind the curtain, almost too quiet to hear, "Okay." Jackson stood in his own cabin in the middle of the night in July, with a woman he'd known for 4 hours and 2 children he'd found in a canyon 3 weeks ago, and the lamp burning low on the table, and the summer wind coming through the window. He thought, "I will not let them down." He thought, "I have to not let them down." He had no idea what came next. He had no plan beyond morning. The whole thing was stitched together with urgency and desperation, and the willingness of one woman to stand up in a saloon when every man in the room had looked away. But the children were asleep behind that curtain. And Eleanor Whitmore was here. And the lamp was burning. And dawn was coming. Dawn broke over Aspen Ridge the way trouble usually did, quiet at first, then all at once. Jackson hadn't slept. He'd sat at the table with the lamp turned low and listened to the cabin breathe around him, the soft, even rhythm of 2 children sleeping behind the curtain. The occasional shift of Eleanor, settling into the chair by the window where she'd refused the floor bedroll he'd offered, and instead folded her coat into a cushion and sat upright like a woman who'd made a decision and intended to inhabit it fully. Sometime around 3 in the morning, she'd said without looking up from the book she'd retrieved from her bag, "You should rest. You'll need to be clear-headed when he comes." "I'm fine," Jackson said. "You're not," she said, still not looking up. "But suit yourself." He hadn't rested, but he'd been grateful she said it. The county representative arrived at 5:20. Jackson heard the horse before he saw it, a single rider coming up the ridge road, at a pace that suggested official business and no particular hurry, the kind of pace that said, "I have the authority here, and I know it." He was at the door before the man dismounted. His name was Gerald Potts, And he was everything Jackson had expected from a territorial county office, soft in the middle, hard in the eyes, carrying a leather satchel and a clipboard, and wearing a coat that was too warm for July, and a hat that had never seen rain. He was maybe 50. He had the look of a man who'd spent 30 years deciding other people's fates from behind a desk, and had come to believe that this was the natural order of things. He looked at Jackson. He looked at the cabin. He looked back at Jackson. "Mr. Hale," he said. "Mr. Potts. I'm here regarding the minor children reported to be in your custody, Luke and Molly." He checked his clipboard, listed as Hale, though no formal relation has been established. He said formal relation the way people said things they'd said 100 times before and had stopped attaching any meaning to. "Is the situation as reported? You are unmarried and was." Jackson said. Potts paused. "I beg your pardon. Was unmarried. A beat. You're saying the situation has changed." "I'm saying it changed last night. We can show you the document." Potts's eyes moved past Jackson's shoulder, and Jackson stepped back from the doorway just enough. Eleanor was standing at the table. She'd done something with her hair that made her look more composed than anyone had a right to look on 3 hours of sleep in a chair. She held the marriage certificate in both hands. Potts came inside. He took the document. He read it with the deliberate slowness of a man making sure everyone understood that his reading of a document was the important part of this transaction. Jackson watched him. Eleanor watched him. From behind the curtain, silence, but the particular silence of 2 children holding very still. "Judge Harcourt," Potts said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "He performed the ceremony last night. His wife witnessed it. This was performed at," Potts checked the time notation, 9:57 in the evening. "That's correct. That's quite late for a wedding." "We didn't see the point in waiting," Eleanor said. Her voice was exactly as even as it had been every time she'd spoken since Jackson had known her, which was now approximately 8 hours. "The children needed the situation resolved. We resolved it." Potts looked at her. Something moved in his face, a small recalculation the kind men did when they encountered a woman who was not going to be managed by tone. "Mrs. Hale," he said, testing it. "Yes," Eleanor said, without any hesitation, and Jackson noted that the steadiness of it, the way she took the name, like she'd already decided to carry it without complaint. Potts looked around the cabin. He looked at the curtain. "The children," he said. "I'll need to see them." Jackson moved to the curtain. He pulled it back. Luke was sitting up straight in the bed with Molly pressed against his side, her face half buried in his shoulder. Luke was looking at Potts the way he'd looked at Jackson in that canyon 3 weeks ago. The same jaw, the same stillness, the same calculation behind the eyes of a 9-year-old who had learned that adults were not automatically safe and that vigilance was the only currency he had left. Potts looked at them. Molly tightened her grip on Luke's shirt. Luke said nothing. He just looked. And something shifted in Potts's face, something small and involuntary, something that the 30 years behind the desk hadn't entirely managed to iron out. He cleared his throat. "Are you Luke?" he said. "Yes, sir," Luke said, flat and polite the way children spoke to people they weren't sure of. "Are you being treated well here?" A pause. Luke glanced at Jackson, then at Eleanor. "Yes, sir," he said again. And this time there was something in it, not just flatness, something that was almost very carefully real. Potts wrote something on his clipboard. He looked at the cabin again, the clean surfaces, the breakfast things Eleanor had set out when she heard the horse, the small arrangement of a wildflower in a tin cup on the windowsill that Molly had put there last week. He handed the certificate back to Eleanor. "The paperwork appears to be in order," he said. He said it the way people said things when they'd come prepared to do one thing and the world had arranged itself so that thing wasn't necessary, and they hadn't yet decided how they felt about that. "I'll note in my report that the situation has been resolved. There will be a follow-up in 90 days to confirm the children's welfare." "We'll be here," Jackson said. Potts picked up his satchel. He walked to the door. He paused there, one hand on the frame, and looked back at Eleanor, at Jackson, at the curtain behind which Luke and Molly were still sitting pressed together in the bed. "They're lucky," he said, not warmly, just honestly. "Children don't usually get lucky." Then he left. Jackson stood in the doorway and listened to the horse picking its way back down the ridge road until the sound was gone. Behind him he heard the curtain move. He heard Luke's feet hit the floor. He heard Molly say something he couldn't make out, and Luke answer her in a low voice, and then footsteps crossing toward the table. He turned around. Luke was standing in the middle of the cabin. He'd gotten dressed at some point in the dark, apparently, so he'd be ready for whatever came through the door. He was looking at Jackson with those careful eyes. "He's gone," Luke said. "He's gone. And he's not coming back. Not to take us. Not today, not in 90 days if we're still standing, and we will be. He'll come back to check on you, that's all." Luke processed this. His jaw moved. He looked at his shoes for a moment. Then he looked up. Not at Jackson. At Eleanor, who was standing at the table with the certificate in her hands, watching Luke with an expression that was very quiet and very attentive. "You married him," Luke said, "for us." "I married him because it was the right thing to do," Eleanor said. "Those aren't always the same as the easy thing. But yes, for you." Luke looked at her for a long moment. "My mama used to say," he said slowly, like he was locating the memory carefully, "that real people do real things, that anybody can say things." "Your mama was right," Eleanor said. Another pause. Then Luke walked to the table and sat down in the chair across from her and said, "Can I have breakfast now?" And that small, ordinary, enormous thing was when Jackson finally let himself breathe. The first days were not easy. Nobody pretended they were. Eleanor was methodical in the way she moved through the cabin, not pushing, not performing, not announcing her presence any louder than it needed to be. She made room for herself with the quiet precision of a woman who understood that she was the newcomer here, not them. She didn't rearrange anything without asking. She didn't take over the cooking without first sitting beside Jackson and understanding how he'd been doing it, which was badly, and then offering improvements one at a time rather than all at once. Luke watched everything she did. Watched her the way he watched the weather, always from a slight distance, never staring directly, but always tracking. He was polite. He said please and thank you. He answered questions. He did not volunteer anything, and he did not, for the first 3 days, say anything to Eleanor that wasn't a direct response to something she'd said first. Jackson noticed. Eleanor noticed too. She didn't push. On the 4th morning she was at the table with a book. She always seemed to have a book pulled from that carpet bag with the infinite resource of a woman who'd packed for a long trip, even when she hadn't known she was taking one. And Luke came and sat across from her without saying anything. He sat there for a while. Eleanor kept reading. She didn't look up. "What's it about?" Luke said finally. She turned the book so he could see the cover. "A man who gets shipwrecked and has to figure out how to survive alone," she said. Luke considered this. "Does he?" "He does. It takes a long time and he makes a lot of mistakes. But he figures it out." Luke pulled the book slightly toward himself, looked at the page she was on. He couldn't read fast. Jackson knew that much from 3 weeks of watching him sound out words with the patient frustration of a boy who'd had spotty schooling on the road. But he tried. "I could teach you," Eleanor said, not looking up. "To read faster, if you wanted." Long pause. "I know how to read," Luke said. "I know you do. I meant faster." Pause. "Maybe," Luke said, and pushed the book back. But he didn't leave the table. Molly was different. Molly had decided something about Eleanor in the first 5 minutes in the dark through the curtain over the question of soft hands, and she was working out what to do with that decision in the particular way that 6-year-olds worked things out, which was directly and without warning. On the 2nd day, she appeared at Eleanor's elbow while Eleanor was kneading bread dough and said, "My mama had yellow hair." "Did she?" Eleanor said, not stopping what she was doing. "Yours is dark." "It is." Molly considered this with great seriousness. I think dark is nice too, she said finally, in the tone of a verdict. Thank you, Eleanor said. That's kind. Molly watched the bread dough for a while. Then, can I help? Wash your hands first, Eleanor said. Molly ran to the wash basin. That evening after dinner, Jackson was out at the barn doing the last of the evening chores when Eleanor came and leaned in the barn doorway. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there. She asked me today, Eleanor said, if I was going to stay. Jackson kept working. What did you say? I said yes. A pause. I said yes, as long as she was here, I'd be here. She believe you. I don't know yet. She's 6. She needs to see it, not just hear it. Eleanor folded her arms. How long before this town decides to have an opinion about us? Jackson almost smiled. Town's already having opinions. Has been since last night. I know. Mrs. Clifton gave me a look this afternoon when I wrote in for supplies that could have cured meat. Mrs. Clifton gives everyone that look. I got a special edition. Eleanor's voice was dry. I'm the woman who married a mountain hermit in a saloon at 10 at night. That's going to follow me for a while. I'm sorry for that, Jackson said. Don't be. I made a choice. She was quiet for a moment. What I'm less certain about is what Aspen Ridge is going to do with that choice. Small towns have long memories and short charity. Jackson put down what he was doing and turned to look at her. You regretting it? He asked. He kept his voice flat because it was the only way he knew to ask the question honestly without putting weight on her answer. Eleanor looked at him steadily. No, she said. I'm not built for regret. It doesn't help anything. She unfolded her arms. I'm asking because I want to know what we're walking into. What's Samuel Granger to this town? The name landed in the evening quiet like a stone in still water. Jackson said, Where did you hear that name? Clifton's wife. In between the looks she talked. Apparently Mr. Granger was very interested in this property. Has been for 2 years, and apparently... Eleanor paused. He expressed some displeasure through back channels at the idea of you suddenly having a legal household and legal custody of children that would make it considerably harder to pressure you off this land. Jackson was still. He told Clifton's wife that, he said. He told someone who told someone. That's how small towns work. Eleanor watched him. What is he to you specifically? Samuel Granger was the largest landowner in the Aspen Ridge Valley, 3,000 acres of summer pasture and timber rights that he'd acquired over 20 years through a combination of shrewd dealing and the kind of pressure that never quite crossed into anything a law office would prosecute. He'd wanted Jackson's Ridge for the timber. Jackson had said no 3 times in 2 years. Granger had taken to working around him, buying up the neighboring parcels, pressuring the merchants Jackson traded with, and more recently, Jackson suspected being the one who'd sent the initial report to the county office about 2 unaccompanied children living with an unmarried man. Jackson had not been able to prove that last part. He'd thought about it for 3 weeks. He said, He's a man who's used to getting what he wants and doesn't know how to stop when the answer's no. That's what I thought, Eleanor said. I've met that kind before. A pause. Does he know we're married now? By sunrise, probably. By breakfast, definitely. Then we should expect something. She said it without drama, just forward planning the voice of a woman who had learned to see trouble coming and prepare for it, rather than hoping it would pass. I don't know what yet, but he's not going to take this quietly. Jackson looked at her. In the last of the evening light, she was very direct and very steady, and he found to his own surprise that he was glad she was here for something that had nothing to do with the county man or the certificate or the children's safety. She was someone to stand next to. He hadn't had that in 7 years. You should know, he said, that I've spent 2 years not backing down from him. That's likely to keep. Good, she said simply. Because backing down isn't something I'm familiar with either. She went back inside. Jackson stood in the barn doorway for a moment and looked up at the summer sky going dark above the pines. Then he went inside too. The first move from Granger's direction came 8 days after the wedding. It didn't come from Granger himself. That was how he worked. It came in the form of 3 of his ranch hands appearing in town on a Saturday morning when Jackson had brought Luke in to pick up lumber and wire for a fence repair. They were large men, all 3 of them, with the particular posture of men who'd been hired to be large in a specific directed way. They didn't do anything. That was the thing. They just appeared at the feed store, while Jackson was loading supplies at the street corner, when Luke was carrying a length of board along the boardwalk, when they walked back to the horses. Just present. Just watching. A performance of presence that was designed to communicate one clear thing. We see you, and we could do something about that if we wanted to. Luke felt it. Jackson could tell by the way the boy's shoulders went tight, the way he kept pace exactly at Jackson's side without being asked, the way he stopped looking around with the normal curiosity of a 9-year-old and started tracking the 3 men with his peripheral vision. He was 9 years old, and he was already learning to read a room for threats. That made something cold move through Jackson's chest. At the horses, Jackson crouched to Luke's level. He said, "You see those 3 men?" "Yes," Luke said. "Don't let them see that you've noticed." Luke, to his credit, didn't look. He kept his eyes on the saddlebag he was pretending to adjust. "Who are they?" "Men who work for someone who wants this family gone." Luke's jaw did that thing, the tightening the setting. "Are they going to try to make us go?" "They're going to try to make us want to go," Jackson said. "There's a difference, and the answer to both versions is the same." "No," Luke said. "No." Jackson confirmed. They rode home without incident. Jackson said nothing to Eleanor about it that evening, not wanting to alarm the children. But later, when Molly was asleep and Luke had retreated behind the curtain with the Robinson Crusoe book that Eleanor had quietly left on his pillow 3 days ago, a thing she'd done without making any announcement about it, Jackson told her. She listened without interrupting. "Intimidation tactic," she said when he'd finished. "Classic. It's designed to make you feel outnumbered before anything has actually happened." "It is," Jackson said. "Did it work?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "Good." She was quiet for a moment. "He's going to escalate. That's what men like that do when the first thing doesn't work. We need to be ahead of him, not behind." "What does ahead look like to you?" Eleanor thought. "It looks like knowing what he's legally entitled to do and what he isn't. It looks like making sure everyone in this town who might be persuaded to stand with us has a reason to do so before we need them." She paused. "Do you have a lawyer?" "Never needed one." "You need one now." She said it without blame. "There's a man in Durango, Thomas Webb. He has a reputation for not being bought. I knew his wife before she passed. I could write to him." Jackson looked at her. "You've been thinking about this?" "Since the conversation in the barn," she said. "I told you I'd seen his kind before. The first husband of a woman I taught with same type, smaller scale. She waited until she had no options left." A pause. "I don't intend to do that." "Write the letter," Jackson said. She wrote it that night at the table by lamplight, in a small exact hand that looked like it belonged to someone who'd spent years making sure children could read what she'd written. Jackson watched her write without meaning to, and looked away. 3 days later, Aspen Ridge showed them what Granger's next move looked like. It came through the school. There was a small schoolhouse in town, 1 room, 1 teacher, roughly a dozen children in assorted ages from 6 to 13. The teacher, a young man named Dodd, who'd arrived from back east the previous fall, had come to the cabin 2 days after the county man left to say he'd be pleased to have Luke and Molly attend. Jackson had shaken his hand. Eleanor had asked 3 specific questions about the reading curriculum that had caused Dodd to look at her with the particular expression of a teacher who had just realized he was talking to another teacher, and he'd straightened slightly, and answered more carefully after that. Luke had gone for 3 days, and said nothing about it, which Jackson had learned meant it was neither terrible nor wonderful, and he was waiting to decide. Molly had come home on the 3rd day with a drawing she'd made of the cabin, and had put it on the table with the air of a person presenting evidence. On the 4th day, Dodd rode up to the cabin in the late afternoon with his hat in his hands. and the expression of a man about to say something he'd rather not say. Jackson met him in the yard. "Mr. Hale," Dodd said, "I want you to know this is not my decision, and I want that on record." "What decision?" Dodd's grip on his hat tightened. "The school board met last night. Mr. Granger sits on the board. He raised a concern." He paused, clearly choosing his words, about the background of the children, specifically their parentage. He claimed that without documentation of the parents' identities, there was no way to establish whether the children had any claim to residency in the Aspen Ridge district. He called for their enrollment to be suspended pending investigation. Jackson was very still. "He's pulling them out of school," Jackson said. "He's calling for a suspension, which in practice means he's pulling them out of school." Jackson's voice was flat. "To do what? To hurt me through them." Dodd couldn't hold his gaze. "I believe that's the intent, yes. I voted against it. It was 3-1. I'm sorry." "Does the board make this decision on its own?" Dodd hesitated. "There's a right of appeal to the territorial school authority, but that process takes time." "How much time?" "Months, sometimes longer." Jackson said nothing for a moment. The sound of the afternoon birds whined in the pines, the distant sound of Molly's voice from inside the cabin, felt very clear and very close. "Thank you for coming to tell me yourself," Jackson said finally. Dodd nodded. He looked wretched. He was a young man in a situation he'd had no power over, and he knew it. "For what it's worth, Mr. Hale, they're good children. Luke has real ability if someone gives him time. And Molly?" He paused. "Molly told me yesterday that her new mother taught her a word, and she wanted to know how to spell it." Jackson looked at him. "What word?" Dodd almost smiled despite everything. "Steadfast," he said. Jackson stood in the yard after Dodd rode away and looked at nothing for a long moment. Then he went inside. Eleanor was at the table. She looked at his face. She didn't ask. She just waited. "School board suspended the children's enrollment," he said. "Granger's play. No legal documentation of the parents, so no confirmed residency. They're calling for an investigation." Eleanor was very still. Then she said, "Where does Luke think he's going tomorrow morning?" "To school. Does he like it?" Jackson thought about the book on the pillow. About Luke at the table with Robinson Crusoe, 3 nights running, sounding out sentences under his breath, getting faster each night, without acknowledging that he was getting faster. "He's starting to." Eleanor stood up. She set down the cup she was holding. She walked to the window. She stood there with her back to him, and her arms folded, and Jackson could see the particular stillness of someone running through options very quickly, in a mind that didn't waste motion. "He used the school board," she said, "because it's a mechanism he controls and it touches the children directly. He knows that's where you'll hurt." A pause. "He's not wrong. But he's made an error." "What error?" She turned around. "He assumed you'd respond to the children being hurt by backing down," she said. "He assumed the pain of it would make the fight feel too costly. He doesn't understand what kind of man you are." Her eyes were direct and very clear. "And he doesn't know what kind of woman just married you." Jackson looked at her. "What are you going to do?" he said. "First, I'm going to teach those children myself," she said. "Right here, every morning. Luke will not lose a single day of learning because Samuel Granger thinks children are useful tools." She said it the way she said most things, without drama, with the force of something that had been decided and was no longer negotiable. Second, Thomas Webb needs to know about the school board action. This establishes a pattern. A judge who sees a pattern has something to work with. "The letter went 3 days ago," Jackson said. "No reply yet." "There will be." She paused. "And third." She stopped. Jackson waited. "Third," she said more quietly, "we need to know who else in this town he's done this to. Granger doesn't operate through channels without practice. He's pushed other people. Some of them may be willing to say so." She looked at Jackson. "Who do you trust in Aspen Ridge?" Jackson thought. It was a shorter list than it should have been. "Roy Casper," he said, "the deputy. He's not brave, but he's honest. He doesn't like what Granger does. He just doesn't know what to do about it. Anyone else? The woman who runs the dry goods, Nora Beale. Her husband had a parcel Granger wanted. He died before he could sell it, and she held it. He's tried to pressure her 3 times. She's still there. Still there, Jackson said. Still holding. Something moved in Eleanor's expression. Recognition, maybe. Or respect. Then we start with her, Eleanor said. From behind the curtain, Molly's voice floated out into the cabin, small and sleepy. She'd fallen asleep early on the bed after dinner. Mr. Jackson. Right here, Jackson said. Is something wrong? He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him. No, Jackson said. We're just making plans. A pause. Good plans. The best kind, Eleanor said. Silence from behind the curtain. Then the particular silence of a child settling back into sleep, the small exhale of someone who's been carrying worry and has decided for tonight to set it down. Jackson looked at the door. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the curtain behind which 2 children were asleep in a bed that was theirs, in a cabin that was theirs on a mountain that Samuel Granger wanted and was not going to get. He said, "First thing tomorrow." First thing, Eleanor said. Nora Beale was a woman who measured everything before she moved. Jackson had known her 6 years. She'd come to Aspen Ridge as a young bride, helped her husband build the dry goods store from a single room into the most reliable supply point between here and Durango. Buried him 3 winters ago, when his heart gave out between the counter and the storeroom, and then simply kept working. She didn't talk much. She didn't complain. She kept exact accounts, gave fair credit, and had once told a man twice her size to get out of her store and not come back when she caught him short-changing a miner's widow. The man had left. She was the kind of woman a town depended on and rarely thanked. Eleanor walked in first. Jackson came behind. Nora looked up from the counter, looked at Eleanor with frank curiosity, looked at Jackson and said, "So you're the one who married him?" "I am," Eleanor said. Brave woman. "Practical one," Eleanor said. "May we have a few minutes?" Nora put down her pencil. They talked for 40 minutes. Jackson said little. This was, he understood, without being told Eleanor's conversation. She'd read the situation, and she knew what it needed. Not a mountain cowboy making demands, but one woman talking to another woman who had learned the same hard lessons through different doors. Eleanor laid it out clean. Granger's pattern, the land pressure, the school board move, the way he worked, never directly, always through mechanisms, always with enough distance between himself and the action that nothing stuck legally. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't appeal to emotion. She just put the facts on the counter the way Nora put goods on a shelf, plainly where they could be examined. Nora listened with her arms folded and her eyes sharp. When Eleanor finished, Nora said, "He sent 2 men to my door 4 months after Thomas died. Said he wanted to make an offer on the building. I said no. They came back. I said no again, and I said it with a shotgun this time, which clarified things." A pause. "He's had the county assessor up here twice claiming my property taxes might need to be reevaluated. Both times they looked around, found nothing wrong left. Message received, though." "Has he done anything you could put in a formal statement?" Eleanor said. Nora was quiet for a moment. "You're building a case," she said. "I'm building a record," Eleanor said. "There's a lawyer in Durango, Thomas Webb, who I believe will take this seriously if we can show a pattern. Granger's been doing this long enough that he's gotten comfortable. Comfortable men get careless. Careless men leave evidence." Nora looked at Jackson. "You trust her," she said. "Blunt as a board." "Yes," Jackson said. Nora appeared to take this as sufficient. She looked back at Eleanor. "I have the assessor's written notices," she said. "Both of them. I kept everything." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Eleanor said. They left Nora's store 20 minutes later with a promise of documentation and the name of 2 other families, the Henley homestead east of the Ridge Road, and old Abe Marsh, who ran the sawmill, who Nora believed had their own version of the same story. "She'll hold," Eleanor said as they walked to the horses. "She's been holding alone for 3 years," Jackson said. "She was waiting for a reason to move." "People usually are," Eleanor said. "They just need someone to walk through the door first." They rode to the Henley place next. Calvin Henley was 40, weathered careful with words. His wife Ruth was quieter still, but her eyes missed nothing. They'd had a parcel, 12 acres of summer grazing, that Granger had wanted for 2 years. Last spring, one of Granger's men had ridden through the fence line on the eastern boundary 3 separate times, each time claiming the horse had gotten loose. The third time, they'd found the fence posts not just broken, but pulled and stacked deliberate, but again, nothing you could prove. Calvin had repaired the fence each time without a word. "Why didn't you report it?" Eleanor asked. Calvin looked at his hands. "Report it to who? Roy Casper. Roy's a decent man. He'd file a paper, and Granger would hear about the paper within the day, and then what?" He shook his head. "I got a wife and 3 children on this land. You don't poke at things when poking makes you a target." "You're already a target," Eleanor said. Not harshly, just honestly. "Granger hasn't stopped because he ran out of interest. He stopped because he found a more immediate problem to handle." She paused. "Us. Which means when he's done trying to push us off, he comes back to you. And the next time he won't bother with the fence. He'll find something bigger." Ruth Henley, who hadn't spoken yet, said Calvin. Just his name. But the way she said it made Calvin look at her, and whatever passed between them in that look was the kind of communication that takes years to build. Calvin said, "What do you need from us?" By the time they turned back toward the mountain, they had 3 families willing to document what Granger had done to them. It wasn't a lawsuit yet, it wasn't even close. But it was a record, and a record was a start, and Granger had no idea it was being assembled, because he'd looked at Jackson Hale and seen a lone man on a mountain with no lawyer, no connections, and no wife, and he hadn't yet recalculated for the woman who'd walked into that saloon and changed the equation. That miscalculation Eleanor had noted to Jackson on the ride back was going to cost him. Jackson had said, "He's not going to wait forever before he does something harder." "No," she'd agreed. "He's not, which is why we have to move faster than he does." Thomas Webb's reply arrived 11 days after Eleanor sent the letter. Jackson saw her read it at the table, saw her expression go from careful to something close to satisfaction. "He's coming," she said. 2 weeks. He'll take the case. "He says the pattern I described warrants a full review. He wants to meet with the families, examine the documentation, and assess whether there's grounds for a formal complaint to the territorial authority." She set the letter down. "He also says, and this is the part that matters, that he's been watching Granger for 3 years and has been looking for the right case." Jackson looked at her. "We're the right case. We're the most documented case, and we have the most to lose in the shortest time, which makes us motivated." She paused. "He'll be here in 2 weeks, which gives us 2 weeks to make sure Granger doesn't do something we can't recover from before then." It was Luke who noticed the men watching the cabin. He came inside on a Tuesday afternoon. He and Molly had been in the yard while Eleanor ran the morning lesson at the table, and Jackson was out checking the upper fence line, and he stood in the doorway and said without preamble, "There are 2 men on the ridge to the east. They've been there since morning." Eleanor was at the table. She looked up. Jackson wasn't back yet. "How long have you been watching them?" she said. "Since they got there," Luke said. "I didn't say anything for a while because I wanted to know if they were going to do something. And they just watch, but they write things down. One of them has paper." Eleanor stood up. She didn't go to the window. "Did they see you notice them?" "No," Luke said with the certainty of a 9-year-old who had been practicing not being noticed since long before he came to this mountain. Eleanor thought for a moment. "Go back outside. Take Molly toward the garden away from that ridge. Normal. Don't look at the ridge." Luke nodded. He turned to go. "Luke," Eleanor said. He stopped. "You did right to tell me," she said. "And you did right to watch and wait first. That was good thinking." Something in the boy's face moved, small, controlled, but real. He went back outside. Eleanor went to the barn and saddled her horse. She left a note on the table in case Jackson came back before her, and she rode not toward the ridge, not directly, but around the long way through the lower tree line, until she had an angle that let her see the two men without being seen herself. They were Grangers, all right. She didn't recognize their faces, but she recognized their stillness, the practiced, paid stillness of men doing a job they'd done before. One had binoculars. The other had paper, as Luke had said, and was writing with the occasional careful notation of someone building a log. They were documenting the cabin. The comings and goings. Who was there? When? Maybe looking for something, anything that could be used. Eleanor watched them for 10 minutes. Then she rode back. When Jackson came in from the upper fence an hour later and found Eleanor's note, and then Eleanor herself sitting at the table, with the particular stillness of someone who had already processed their anger and moved through to the other side of it, he read her face before she said a word. "Tell me," he said. She told him, all of it. The men, what Luke had seen, what she'd confirmed. She told it flat and fast, no dramatics, which somehow made it worse. "He's building a counterfile," Jackson said. "Yes, looking for anything he can use. Neglect, misconduct, something to bring back to the county and argue that the marriage is insufficient for proper guardianship." She paused. "Or looking for something to use against me specifically. My reputation, my background. Anything that makes me look unsuitable." Jackson's jaw tightened. "He won't find anything," he said. "He doesn't need to find anything real," Eleanor said. "He just needs to find something he can shape." She looked at Jackson. "We need Roy Casper. Today." Roy came that evening, reluctant and apologetic, in the way he always was when he was about to be asked to do something that put him between two forces he'd rather stay clear of. He sat at Jackson's table and held his coffee with both hands and listened. When they finished, he said, "I can't arrest a man for watching a property from a public ridge." "I know that," Jackson said. "I'm not asking you to arrest anyone. I'm asking you to ride up there and let them know they've been seen. Officially. So there's a record that you observed them and that they were identified as Granger's employees." Roy shifted. "If I do that, Granger knows I've—" "Roy." Jackson's voice was quiet and very direct. "You know what he's doing. You've known for 2 years what he does to people in this valley. I'm not asking you to fight him. I'm asking you to do the minimum that your badge requires and nothing more." A long silence. It was Eleanor who said more quietly, "Deputy Casper, those children in that room have already lost everything once. Everything they have right now exists because people, just a few people, were willing to do the minimum required of them at the right moment. That's all I'm asking of you. The minimum." Roy looked at her. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the curtain where, if you were quiet enough, you could hear the low sound of Luke reading to Molly. The patient older brother voice working through sentences, Molly interrupting with questions, Luke answering them with the particular mix of exasperation and love that had become over these weeks one of the sounds Jackson associated with the word home. Roy put down his coffee. He picked up his hat. "I'll ride up there now," he said. He did. The two men were gone by the time Roy reached the ridge. But Roy filed a report, which meant Granger knew that Roy had filed a report, which meant Granger knew that Jackson was documenting back. It was the right move. Eleanor said so. Jackson believed her. What neither of them anticipated was what Granger did next. It came on a Thursday. Market day in Aspen Ridge, which meant half the valley was in town, and the street was as full as it ever got in summer, and everyone saw it. Jackson had brought Luke in to help carry supplies. He'd been doing that more deliberately, giving the boy tasks that required adult-level responsibility, because Luke grew into responsibility the way most plants grew toward light visibly, and with intent. They were at the feed store loading a wagon when the commotion started at the far end of the street. Jackson heard it before he saw it. Raised voices, then a crash, then the particular sound of a crowd pulling together around something. He said, "Stay here," to Luke and moved toward it. He didn't get 10 steps before Luke was at his side. I said, "I'm not staying where I can't see you." Luke said, flat and final. 9 years old and already immovable on certain points. Jackson didn't have time to argue. They moved together. Granger's oldest son, Dale, 23, built like his father, but with none of the patience that made his father dangerous, and all of the impulse that made him something worse, was standing in the middle of the street. He'd apparently knocked over a cart belonging to old Pete Marsh, Abe Marsh's youngest boy, and was now in the process of making it Pete's fault loudly and in front of as many people as possible. But that wasn't the part Jackson saw. The part Jackson saw was Dale Granger's hand on the collar of a boy who was unmistakably Luke's size and age, and who was Jackson processed this in half a second. Not a boy he recognized, which meant it wasn't Luke, which meant his heart rate could theoretically descend from where it had just spiked. The boy was one of the Henley children, Calvin Henley's middle son. He'd apparently been nearby when the cart went over, and Dale had grabbed him, claiming he'd been the one who'd knocked it. It was a lie. Jackson could see that from 15 feet. Every person watching could see that. Dale wasn't trying to resolve a dispute. He was performing one, loudly publicly with a child's collar in his fist because his father had told him to make noise in this town, and this was how Dale Granger made noise. Jackson walked forward. The crowd parted. Not dramatically, just the natural movement of people who've been standing too close to something they aren't sure about, and are relieved to see someone with a clear direction. Dale saw him coming. He didn't let go of the boy's collar. He puffed up instead, that particular swelling of a man who's been given enough unearned authority that confrontation registers as opportunity. "Hail," he said. "Let go of the boy," Jackson said. "This boy knocked over." "Let go of the boy," Jackson said again. Same volume, same pace, like the first time had been a courtesy, and this time was a fact. Dale's grip tightened. "You don't give orders in this town." Jackson stopped 2 feet away. He looked at Dale with the particular look of a man who has spent 15 years on a mountain where everything that wanted to hurt you was bigger than you and had sharper teeth, and had learned that fear was information and theatrics were noise, and the only question worth asking was, what are you actually going to do? "Your father sent you," Jackson said. "He told you to come down here and make problems. You're making them because he asked you to, and because you don't know how to say no to him." A pause. "That's between you and your father. This boy has nothing to do with it. Let him go." Dale stared at him. The crowd was very still. Jackson didn't move. And Dale Granger, 23, built like a wall, with his father's name behind him, and half a street of witnesses in front of him, let go of the boy's collar. He let go because Jackson Hale didn't flinch, and somewhere underneath all the borrowed authority, Dale Granger understood the difference between a man performing certainty and a man who actually had it. The Henley boy stumbled back. Jackson put a hand on his shoulder, briefly steadying, then let him go. Dale said low and ugly, "This isn't done." "It's done for today," Jackson said. He walked back to Luke. Luke was standing exactly where Jackson had left him, except that he'd moved 3 feet closer, which was the distance Luke had allowed himself before overriding the instruction to stay put. He was watching Dale Granger with those careful eyes. "Come on," Jackson said. "Let's finish loading." "You knew he was going to back down," Luke said, falling into step beside him. "I thought he would." "What if he hadn't?" Jackson was quiet for a moment. "Then we'd have dealt with what came next." Luke considered this. "That's not very reassuring." "No," Jackson agreed. "But it's honest." Something that might have been the beginning of a reluctant smile crossed Luke's face. He picked up a bag of feed and loaded it without being asked. They were back on the mountain by mid-afternoon. Eleanor heard what happened in town from Jackson. She listened with her arms folded, and her expression doing the rapid internal calculation it always did when new information arrived. "Dale's impulsive," she said. "That's useful. Impulsive people make mistakes in public." "He also scared that Henley boy," Jackson said. "He did, which Calvin Henley is going to know about by sundown." She paused. "One more thing for Thomas Webb's file." Thomas Webb arrived on a Wednesday 2 days earlier than expected, which Eleanor took as a good sign. He was a compact man, late 50s with a gray beard kept short, and eyes that moved across a room with the steady inventory of someone whose profession required him to see exactly what was there and not what he'd assumed. He carried a leather case that had clearly survived considerable use, and he arrived having already stopped in town and spoken to Roy Casper, which he mentioned without being asked. "Casper's more useful than he thinks he is," Webb said, settling at the table. "Men like that often are. They know where everything is because they've been watching without participating." He gave me 3 names I didn't have yet. Eleanor set coffee in front of him. He accepted it and looked around the cabin with those inventory eyes, and then looked back at Eleanor and Jackson with an expression that wasn't quite approval, but was adjacent to it. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning, and don't spare anything because you think it makes you look bad. The things people think make them look bad are usually the things that matter most." They talked for 3 hours. Jackson laid out the history of Granger's pressure on the property. Eleanor laid out everything she'd assembled: the families, the documentation, the school board action, the men on the ridge, Dale Granger in the street. Webb asked questions that were short and precise, the kind that cut straight to the center of whatever they were examining. He wrote constantly, small and fast. At the end of 3 hours, he set his pen down. "You have a case," he said. Jackson said against Granger. "Against the school board action, certainly that's the most immediately actionable. The Territorial School Authority has clear guidelines about enrollment rights, and none of Granger's stated grounds hold up to scrutiny. I can have that reversed within 30 days. He paused. "The larger pattern, the intimidation, the land pressure, the use of county mechanisms to harass, that's more complex. It's real, and I believe every word of it, but complex cases need time and documentation. What you've assembled is a good start. Not enough yet." He looked at them both. "I'll tell you what is enough. It's enough for me to write to Granger directly and make clear that his activities are now being formally documented by legal counsel. Men like Granger rely on their targets not having lawyers. The moment you have one, the calculation changes." "Will he stop?" Eleanor said. Webb looked at her. "No, but he'll get careful, and careful men make slower mistakes." He paused. "He'll try something else. Something bigger probably, because he'll feel the pressure, and he'll push back. But when he does, we'll be ready." "What kind of something else?" Jackson said. Webb picked up his pen. "I don't know yet. But in my experience, a man who's been running the same play for 20 years and suddenly finds it not working tends to overreach." He looked at Jackson steadily. "When he overreaches, that's when we move." That was on a Wednesday. On Saturday, Granger overreached. It happened fast. The way serious things tended to not, with warning, not with buildup, just a sudden tear in the fabric of a day that had been until that moment ordinary. Luke hadn't come home. He'd gone into town Saturday morning with Jackson's permission with 2 other boys from neighboring homesteads to watch the farrier work at the livery. One of those entirely 9-year-old activities that Jackson had been quietly grateful for the normalcy of it. Luke moving through the world like a boy rather than a soldier. He was supposed to be back by noon. By 1 o'clock, he wasn't back. By 1:30, Jackson was on his horse. He found Roy Casper at the edge of town riding toward him with an expression that Jackson had not seen on Roy's face before. Not the habitual apology, not the careful neutrality. Something harder. Something that said, whatever had happened, Roy had already decided which side he was on. "Jackson," Roy said. "Luke's at my office. He's not hurt. I need you to hear that first. He's not hurt. But there's been an accusation." Jackson's horse didn't stop moving. "What accusation?" "Dale Granger's claiming Luke assaulted him. Says Luke threw a rock and struck him on the side of the head outside the livery." Roy kept pace alongside him. "He's got a cut. Real one, I saw it. But Jackson..." He paused. "2 boys who were there say Luke didn't do it. They say Dale threw the rock himself and then grabbed Luke." Jackson stopped his horse. He looked at Roy. "He staged it," Jackson said. "That's what it looks like, but I've got Dale Granger's formal complaint, and his father standing in my office right now, and Samuel Granger is calling for Luke to be removed from your custody pending a county review." He's saying the children aren't safe in your home. He's saying you've created an environment of—" Roy paused like the words tasted bad. "Violence and instability." Jackson looked at the sky for 1 second. Just one. Then he looked back at Roy. "Where is Luke right now?" "Sitting in my office. He hasn't said a word since I brought him in. Not one word." "Is Samuel Granger still in your office?" "Yes. With his lawyer." Jackson started writing again. Roy said Jackson wait. His lawyer's already drawn up papers. A petition for emergency custody review. He's going to file it today unless— "Unless what?" Roy's voice was careful. "Unless you back down. That's what Granger said. He said he'll drop the complaint and the petition if you deed the upper ridge to him. That's the deal." Jackson rode. Roy kept pace. "He's using Luke," Jackson said, not a question. "Yes," Roy said. "Then there's no deal." Jackson's voice was flat and clear as a bell. "There's never going to be a deal. That man is not getting 1 acre of this family's land. Not now. Not because he's manufactured a charge against a 9-year-old boy to force it." Roy said nothing, but he kept riding with Jackson, which was in its way the thing that mattered. They came through the door of Roy's office together. Samuel Granger was standing on one side of the room. He was 60, silver-haired, impeccably dressed for a Saturday in a town this small, because he was always performing authority. He had a lawyer beside him, a soft, precise man Jackson didn't know, and Dale in the corner with a bandage on his temple, and the expression of someone who'd been told what to do today and had done it and wasn't sure how he felt about that. Luke was sitting against the far wall on a bench. He looked at Jackson when Jackson came through the door. His face was completely controlled, no tears, no fear, at least none that he was letting out, but his hands were pressed flat against his thighs in the way they got when he was holding himself together through sheer force. Jackson crossed the room and crouched in front of him. "You okay?" he said. "I didn't throw anything," Luke said. His voice was steady and contained and furious in the particular way of a person who has been falsely accused and knows that being furious about it will be held against them. "I know that," Jackson said. "He threw it himself, and then he grabbed me and I couldn't—" Luke stopped, his jaw set. "I didn't throw anything." "I know," Jackson said again. Same voice, same certainty. He stood up. He turned around. He looked at Samuel Granger. The room was very quiet. Granger smiled the small, confident smile of a man who believed he controlled the exits. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I think you'll find this situation can be resolved very simply." "I found a lawyer," Jackson said. The smile stayed. "One lawyer against Thomas Webb," Jackson said. The smile didn't disappear, but something behind it did. Something shifted in Granger's eyes, a rapid internal recalculation there, and gone in less than a second. "Webb's already written his letter," Jackson said, "to you, to the Territorial School Authority, and to the Circuit Court in Denver. He's been here 4 days. He's spoken to 6 families in this valley who have documentation of what you've done to them. He's building a case that has your name at the center of it." He paused. "You want to add a false charge against a 9-year-old orphan to that file? Go ahead. File it today. I'll be at Webb's office by Monday morning to answer it, and every person in this town who watched your son manufacture that accusation will be available to testify." Granger's jaw moved. His lawyer leaned toward him and said something low. Granger said very carefully, "You're making a mistake." "I've made plenty," Jackson said. "This isn't one of them." A long, terrible silence. Then Roy Casper. Roy, who didn't like conflict, who had spent his career carefully positioned between forces larger than himself, stepped forward and said in the quiet, deliberate voice of a man making a decision he'd been waiting to make, "Mr. Granger, unless you've got evidence to support this complaint, beyond your son's word, against 2 other witnesses, I'm not holding this boy. And if you file that petition without evidence, I'll be adding my own report to the court record." The room held its breath. Granger looked at Roy. He looked at Jackson. He looked at Luke on the bench, who was looking back at him with those dark, steady 9-year-old eyes that had survived a canyon and a storm and 23 years of Samuel Granger in 3 weeks, and were not going to be the thing that looked away first. Granger picked up his hat. He looked at Jackson one last time, and what was in his face then wasn't the smile, wasn't the performance. It was something rawer than that. The look of a man who has just understood for the first time that this is not going to go the way he planned. "We'll see each other again," Granger said. "I expect so," Jackson said. Granger walked out. His lawyer followed. Dale last paused in the doorway and looked at Luke with an expression that might have been shame or might have been resentment, and then he was gone too. The door closed. Roy let out a breath that seemed like it had been building for approximately 3 years. Luke stood up from the bench. He walked to Jackson and stood beside him, not behind, not holding on, not asking to be held. Just beside. Shoulder to arm the way he stood when they were working the fence together or loading the wagon. Present and accounted for. Jackson put his hand briefly on the back of the boy's neck. "Let's go home," he said. "Eleanor's going to want to know everything," Luke said. "She is," Jackson agreed, "and she's going to be very controlled about it, and then she's going to write 4 letters. Despite everything, despite the day, despite what had just happened, despite the weight of it." Luke made a sound that was small and quick and entirely unexpected. He laughed. It was the first time Jackson had heard it. A real laugh, not polite, not careful. The laugh of a boy who'd found something genuinely funny in the middle of a hard day and hadn't been able to help it. It was, Jackson thought, as they walked out into the summer afternoon, one of the best sounds he'd heard in 7 years. Luke laughed on the ride home too. Not long, not the free, unguarded laugh of a child who'd never been hurt, but real, caught off guard by his own amusement, quickly recovered like a man who'd forgotten for a moment that he was supposed to be careful, and then remembered, and wasn't entirely sorry he'd forgotten. Jackson didn't comment on it. That was the thing he'd learned about Luke, comment on the soft moments, and they closed up. Leave them alone, and they happened again. They came through this cabin door at 3:30, and Eleanor was at the table with Webb's notes spread in front of her, cross-referencing something in the margin with the focused attention of a woman who treated information like a resource and never wasted it. She looked up when they came in. She looked at Jackson's face. She looked at Luke's. She said, "Sit down and tell me everything." Down. They sat, they told her. Jackson laid out the broad shape of it, and Luke, which was new, which Jackson noted carefully filled in details without being asked. The farrier's yard. The moment Dale appeared. The rock. The grab. The walk to Roy's office with Dale's hand on his collar, and the particular humiliation of being marched through a town that was watching. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face was doing the contained rapid processing that Jackson had come to recognize as the thing that preceded either a letter or a plan. When Luke finished, she said, "Did anyone else see the rock?" "Caleb Morrison and his brother," Luke said. "They were right there. They told Deputy Casper." "Good." She looked at Luke directly. "What you did today, staying quiet, not reacting when he grabbed you, not giving them anything to use, that was right. That was exactly right. I know it didn't feel like enough." Luke looked at the table. "It didn't feel like anything. Sometimes the right thing and the satisfying thing are as far apart as they can be," Eleanor said. "That doesn't make the right thing wrong. It just makes it harder." She paused. "You were brave today. Not the loud kind, the harder kind." Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he said without looking up, "Jackson told Granger about Webb. Right there in front of everyone." Eleanor looked at Jackson. Jackson said, "It seemed like the time." "It was exactly the time," Eleanor said. She held his gaze for a moment, something passing between them that didn't need words, the specific look of two people who have been making decisions in the same direction long enough to recognize when the other one got it right. Then she picked up her pen. 4 letters, she said. Luke made the small sound again, the not quite laugh. Then he got up and went to find Molly. The 4 letters went out the next morning. One to Thomas Webb, documenting the incident in full. One to the Morrison family, formally requesting that Caleb and his brother provide written statements to Webb's office. One to Roy Casper, requesting a copy of the official complaint filing and Roy's own report. And one, the one Eleanor wrote last most carefully, with the smallest handwriting, to the circuit court clerk in Denver, notifying the court that formal legal representation had been retained in the matter of Samuel Granger's pattern of conduct in the Aspen Ridge Valley, and that additional filings should be expected. Thomas Webb. When he received his letter 2 days later, sent back a reply by return writer. Eleanor read it at the table. Jackson watched her face. "He says the school board reversal is moving faster than he expected," she said. "The territorial authority reviewed his petition, and they're inclined to grant it. Could be as soon as 2 weeks." She read further. "He also says," she paused, and something in her expression changed, "that the circuit court in Denver has flagged Granger's name. Apparently we are not the first people to file a complaint. There's a prior matter, a land dispute from 3 years ago that was settled quietly. Webb thinks he can get the record unsealed." Jackson was still. "Someone else tried to fight him before," he said. "And couldn't," Eleanor said. "Or didn't have enough." She set the letter down. "We have more." What happened next was 12 days of what Eleanor called the quiet war. No confrontations, no dramatic moves. Just the steady, patient work of people who understood that the outcome of a fight like this one wasn't decided in a single moment, but in the accumulation of 100 small ones. The Morrison boys gave their statements. Webb had them notarized and filed. Calvin Henley produced photographs he'd taken of the pulled fence posts. He'd had the presence of mind to do that silently alone, and hadn't mentioned it until Webb asked directly about documentation, and those went into the file too. Nora Beale brought in both assessor's notices and a letter she'd received unsigned, but clearly sourced, suggesting she reconsider her position on the building sale before her business license came up for annual review. That letter, Webb said when he saw it, was the best thing they had. Because threatening a business license was something a court could look at. It had specificity. It had intent. Granger was quiet during those 12 days. Too quiet, Eleanor said. She said it the way people said things when they knew the quiet was a held breath and not an ending. She was right. On the 13th day, Roy Casper rode up the mountain in the late afternoon, and his face had the look it always had when he was carrying bad news, the particular compression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Eleanor saw him first from the window. She said, "Roy's coming," and Jackson came to stand beside her, and they watched him ride up with the same stillness of two people who have been waiting for the next thing and have known it was coming. Roy came inside. He took his hat off. He stood in the middle of the cabin the way he always stood when he was saying something he didn't want to say. "There's a hearing," he said. "Granger's lawyer filed a formal petition for custody review. It's been accepted by the county court. Hearing's in 3 weeks. He looked at Jackson. "He's contending that the marriage is invalid." The room went very still. "On what grounds?" Eleanor said. Roy looked at her. Something in his eyes said he was sorry for what came next. "He's filed an affidavit claiming that your first marriage to Charles Whitmore was never properly dissolved prior to his death. That there's a question of whether the estate was fully settled under territorial law, and that if the estate wasn't fully settled, there may be outstanding legal obligations attached to your name that would render you legally unable to enter into a new marriage contract without court clearance." He paused. "His lawyer is arguing that until that question is resolved, your marriage to Jackson may not be legally binding." Eleanor didn't move. Jackson looked at her. Her face was controlled. Completely. The way it got when something hit hard, and she was deciding in real time how much to let it show. "That's not true," she said. Her voice was level. "Charles's estate was settled. I have the documentation." "Do you have it here?" Roy said. A pause. "It's in Dunn Creek," she said. "With the county clerk's office there. I can write for it." "How long will that take?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. Roy's expression said what he wasn't saying. The hearing was in 3 weeks, and Granger's lawyer had filed this knowing exactly how long it would take to retrieve the documentation and had timed the petition accordingly. Eleanor knew it too. Jackson could see it in the way her jaw moved, that single small adjustment, like something being locked down. "He researched me," she said. Not to Roy, to herself. Then to Roy, "How long has he been looking into my background?" "I don't know. The affidavit's detailed. It's not something put together quickly." "No," Eleanor said. "It isn't." Roy left. The door closed. The cabin was quiet. From outside Molly's voice, she and Luke were in the yard, and she was narrating something with great enthusiasm to apparently nobody, which was a thing Molly did when she was working out a story in her head. Eleanor stood at the table with her hands flat on the surface and looked at nothing. Jackson said, "Eleanor, he's been planning this since before the wedding," she said. "Possibly before. He knew or had reason to suspect that you might find a way to resolve the marriage question, so he had someone look into whoever you might marry." She paused. "He had someone look into me before I was even part of this." "That means he was watching you in town. It means he was watching you and anyone who might be associated with you." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not afraid of this, Jackson. The estate was settled. I have the documentation. It exists." She looked at him. "But he's bought himself 3 weeks of uncertainty, and during those 3 weeks the county court will technically consider the marriage status unresolved, which means the custody arrangement is unresolved, which means—" "The children," Jackson said. "The children," she said. A pause. "Can Webb move faster?" Jackson said. "I'm going to write to him in the next 10 minutes, Eleanor said. "And I'm going to write to the Dunn Creek County Clerk myself by express rider, if I can get one requesting emergency documentation retrieval. And I'm going to write to Charles's lawyer. He's still practicing. I believe requesting a signed affidavit, confirming the estate settlement." She was already moving toward the writing materials. 3 letters, simultaneously, so that if one route is slow, another one isn't. Jackson watched her. The speed of it, the precision. "You've been through something like this before," he said. She was already writing. She didn't look up. "Charles's first wife had a surviving family who contested the will," she said. "Briefly. We resolved it in 6 weeks." A pause. "I learned that legal problems don't get smaller while you're deciding how to feel about them." She wrote all 3 letters before dinner. The express rider left before dawn. What came back 9 days later was not what they'd expected. It was not the documentation from Dunn Creek. That was still in transit, apparently routed through an office that was understaffed and slow. It was not Charles Whitmore's lawyer, who had retired the previous year, and whose successor needed time to locate the relevant files. What came was a letter from Thomas Webb. Short. Unusually short for a man who tended toward thoroughness. Eleanor read it standing up. She read it twice. Then she sat down. Jackson said, "Tell me." "The circuit court in Denver has agreed to hear the case," she said. "Not the county court hearing. The circuit court. Webb filed an emergency motion, arguing that the county court doesn't have appropriate jurisdiction given the territorial implications of the case, and the circuit court agreed." She looked at him. "The Denver court has taken jurisdiction." Jackson waited. "That's good," he said carefully. "It is," Eleanor said, "because a circuit court judge is not a local man. He's not someone Granger has had 20 years to cultivate. He answers to the territorial authority, not to the county." She paused. "But there's more. Webb says the judge assigned is a man named Arthur Crane. He's been on the circuit bench for 12 years. He has a reputation for," she looked at the letter, "Webb's exact words are not suffering fools or frauds." "That's good," Jackson said more definitely. "Crane has asked for both parties to appear before him in Denver in 3 weeks, not a full hearing, a preliminary review. He wants to see the documentation and hear direct statements from both sides before deciding how to proceed." She set the letter down. "Which means we go to Denver." From the yard, Luke's voice calling Molly for something. The easy authority of an older brother, who'd started to believe, however carefully, that tomorrow was a place he was going to arrive at. Jackson looked at the curtain. He looked at Eleanor. "All four of us," he said. "I've been thinking about that," Eleanor said. "Webb's letter says the judge wants to meet the children. He specifically requested it." Jackson was still. "Crane wants to see them," he said. "He wants to see the family," Eleanor said. "The actual family, not documents, not affidavits. The people." She looked at Jackson. "I think he's already decided that Granger's petition is thin. I think he wants to look at what he'd be disrupting before he decides how far to push back." A pause. "Do we tell them?" Jackson said. "We tell Luke," Eleanor said. "He's old enough to know, and he'll find out anyway, and finding out we hid it will cost us more than telling him costs." She paused. "We tell Molly there's a trip." Jackson nodded. He went to the door and called Luke in. Luke came still dusty from the yard and looked at both of them, the adult look, the assessing look, and said, before either of them could start, something happened. "We need to go to Denver," Jackson said. "All of us, in 3 weeks. There's a judge who wants to see us." Luke was quiet. "To decide if we stay." "To confirm it," Eleanor said. "Not to decide. Granger's trying to use a legal question about my first marriage to create uncertainty about this one. The judge is the man who's going to look at Granger's argument and tell him what it's actually worth." "What is it worth?" Luke said. "Very little," Eleanor said. "But very little isn't nothing, and we have to go address it." Luke sat down. He put his hands on the table, that gesture Jackson recognized, the palms flat, holding still gesture. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked up. "Can I say something in front of the judge?" he said. Eleanor and Jackson looked at each other. "What would you want to say?" Eleanor said. "That it's real," Luke said. His voice was steady and very direct. "This, whatever it is, it's real, and I want someone who matters to know that." He paused. "Because Granger keeps trying to say it isn't, and I'm tired of him getting to define what we are." The cabin was quiet. Eleanor said, "I'll ask Webb." Webb's reply when she wrote to him that evening with the question came back in 4 days. The judge, Webb wrote, has specifically indicated that he will hear from the children if they wish to speak. He is not required to and cannot compel them. But if Luke chooses to make a statement, Judge Crane will hear it. Eleanor read that sentence aloud at the table. Luke was doing his reading across from her. He heard it. He didn't look up from the page, but his shoulders, which had been carrying a particular tension for weeks, dropped just slightly, just enough, and he turned to the next page of Robinson Crusoe and kept reading. The preparation for Denver took 2 weeks. Webb came back up the mountain once more, sat at the table for another 2 hours, and walked them through what to expect the courtroom. The process, the specific questions Judge Crane was likely to ask. He was honest that the documentation question was real. Without the Dunn Creek records confirmed before the hearing, they would be relying on Eleanor's testimony and Charles Whitmore's lawyer's affidavit, which had finally arrived, signed and notarized, confirming the estate settlement in full. "Is that enough?" Jackson said. "It should be," Webb said. "The affidavit is clean and the lawyer is credible." Granger's argument was always thin. He was counting on the delay to create uncertainty, not on the argument itself having merit. Webb paused. "What I'm more interested in is the broader case, the pattern. Crane has the prior matters records. He knows about the unsealed land dispute. If he's inclined to look at the whole picture, rather than just the marriage question, Granger's in considerably worse shape than he thinks." "You think Crane will do that?" Eleanor said. "I think," Webb said carefully, "that a man who's been on the circuit bench for 12 years and has a reputation for not suffering frauds doesn't call a preliminary review just to look at a marriage certificate." The day before they left for Denver, Molly came to Eleanor while she was packing and stood beside her with something in her hands. It was the drawing. The one she'd made at school, the cabin, the pines. The rough shapes of 4 people that could, if you knew what you were looking at, be 4 specific people. "Can you take this?" Molly said. Eleanor looked at the drawing. "To Denver." "So he can see," Molly said. "The judge, so he can see what it looks like." Eleanor took the drawing very carefully. She folded it gently precisely and put it in the inside pocket of her bag closest to hand. "I'll make sure he sees it," she said. Molly looked at her for a moment. Then she reached out and took Eleanor's hand, just held it for a second, the small fingers wrapped around Eleanor's checking something. Eleanor didn't move, didn't make a production of it. Then Molly let go and ran back outside, and Eleanor stood for a moment with the bag in her hands and looked at nothing. Jackson had come in from the barn and had seen the last of it from the doorway. He didn't say anything. Eleanor looked up and saw him standing there and didn't say anything either. They left at dawn. The road to Denver was 3 days, and they made it in steady stages, long days on horseback, with Molly in front of Eleanor for the flat stretches, and transferred to a rented wagon seat when the grade made riding easier. Luke rode beside Jackson most of the way, the two of them mostly quiet, in the way they'd learned to be quiet together, which was different from the silence of strangers. It was the silence of people who had run out of things they needed to say because they'd already said the important ones. On the second evening, camped at a way station and waiting for the fire to settle, Luke said, "What if the judge says no?" Jackson said, "He's not going to." "But if he did?" Jackson looked at the fire. He thought about the honest answer, which was that there was always a version of events that went wrong, and that he'd been sitting with that version of events in the back of his mind for weeks, and had made his peace with fighting it as hard as he could for as long as it took. "Then we appeal," he said, "and we appeal again, and web files, and we document, and we do not stop, because that's what you do when something is worth fighting for." He paused. "And you are worth fighting for, both of you. That's not something I'm going to renegotiate." Luke looked at the fire. "You sound like Eleanor," he said. "Good," Jackson said. "She's usually right." Luke was quiet for another moment. Then, "Jackson." "Yeah, when Molly and I were in the canyon." He stopped, started again. "I'd been there 2 days when you came. I'd been telling Molly someone would come. I didn't actually believe it." Jackson looked at him. "But I kept saying it," Luke said, "because she needed to hear it." His jaw moved. "And then you came." The fire crackled. A horse shifted in the dark beyond the firelight. "I came," Jackson said. "I know," Luke said. "I know you did." He paused. "I just wanted to say that, before Denver. In case—" He stopped. "In case things get hard tomorrow," Jackson said. "Yeah. Things might get hard tomorrow," Jackson said. "That's true, but I came before and I'll keep coming, and that's the one thing in this whole situation that is absolutely not changing." He paused. "You have my word, and I don't give it unless I mean to keep it." Luke looked at him for a long moment. Then he lay down next to the fire and closed his eyes, and his breathing evened out with the particular speed of a genuinely exhausted 9-year-old who'd given himself permission to sleep. Eleanor, who had been sitting slightly back from the fire with Molly asleep against her side, said quietly, "You know what he just did." "What?" Jackson said. "He trusted you," she said. "Completely. Maybe for the first time." She paused. "Don't underestimate what that cost him." Jackson looked at the boy sleeping by the fire. "I know what it cost him," he said. Eleanor looked at him, the fire between them, Molly warm and asleep against her side, Luke asleep on the other side of the flame, the whole precarious stitched-together entirely real thing of them spread out in the dark of a Colorado summer night. "We're going to be all right," Eleanor said. Not a question, not a reassurance. A statement flat and certain the way she said things she'd decided were true. "Yes," Jackson said. Denver came up on the horizon the following afternoon, the sounds of it before the sight. The particular noise of a city that never fully stopped, and Molly, who had never been to a city, went completely still against Eleanor and stared at it with enormous eyes and said, "It's so loud." "It is," Eleanor agreed. "I don't like it," Molly said. "You don't have to like it," Eleanor said. "You just have to get through 3 days of it, and then we go home." Molly thought about this. "Home," she repeated. like she was testing the word, like she was deciding whether she believed in it. Home, Eleanor said again. Steady, certain. Molly settled back against her. They rode into Denver with the afternoon light behind them and the courthouse at the end of the main street ahead, and Jackson Hale looked at that building and thought about Samuel Granger, who had started this because he wanted timber rights on a ridge, and had made the mistake of thinking that wanting something badly enough was the same as being entitled to it. He thought about a woman who had stood up in a saloon when every man in the room had looked away. He thought about a boy who had held a knife in a canyon for 2 days and somehow had enough trust left to give some of it away. He thought, we are going to walk into that building tomorrow and we are going to be exactly what we are, and that is going to be enough. He had to believe that. He did believe it. The horses moved forward. The courthouse in Denver smelled like paper and old wood, and the particular kind of authority that had been accumulating in a building for decades. Webb met them outside at 8 in the morning, 15 minutes before the preliminary review was scheduled. He was already carrying his leather case and had the focused forward energy of a man who had prepared thoroughly and was now running on the particular calm that comes after preparation ends and action begins. He shook Jackson's hand. He nodded to Eleanor with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. He looked at Luke and Molly and said, "Good morning," directly to them, not over them, which Jackson noted. "How are we positioned?" Eleanor said. "Well," Webb said, "better than Granger expected, I think. The affidavit from Charles Whitmore's lawyer arrived at Crane's office yesterday by express. I confirmed it this morning. The estate question is answered." He paused. "The marriage stands." Eleanor's shoulders dropped 1/fraction of an inch. Jackson saw it. She wouldn't have wanted him to, but he did. "Then what's today about?" Jackson said. "Today is about Crane deciding how far he wants to take the broader case," Webb said. The marriage question was Granger's primary weapon. It's been answered. But Crane didn't call this review just for a marriage certificate. He's seen the full file. He knows about the families, the school board, Dale Granger in the street. He looked at Jackson steadily. He wants to look at Samuel Granger. A pause. "Then let him look," Jackson said. They went inside. The courtroom was smaller than Jackson had expected. Not the grand high-ceilinged thing of his imagination, but a working room practical and worn with long benches and a raised bench at the front and tall windows that let in the morning light in flat, useful slabs. It smelled like the rest of the building, like decisions that couldn't be taken back. Granger was already there. He was seated on the left side with his lawyer, the same soft, precise man from Roy's office, and 2 additional men Jackson didn't recognize, both carrying document cases, which meant Granger had brought reinforcements and had spent money on them. He was dressed the way he'd been dressed in Roy's office, performing authority, performing the confidence of a man who bought his way out of consequences and had done so long enough to believe it was the natural order of things. He looked at Jackson when they came in. His face did nothing. Jackson looked back at him. His face did nothing either. They sat on the right side, Molly between Eleanor and Jackson. Luke on Eleanor's other side, straight-backed hands flat on his thighs, the posture he used when he was managing himself very carefully. A door opened at the front of the room. Judge Arthur Crane was not what Jackson had pictured from Webb's description. He'd expected someone imposing in the physical sense, large, commanding the kind of presence that filled a room by volume. Crane was medium height, lean with white hair kept short, and a face that was deeply lined in the way of someone who had spent decades outdoors and then decades indoors thinking hard. He moved without ceremony. He sat. He looked at both tables. His eyes were gray and extremely clear. "Good morning," he said. His voice was conversational, not loud, not performing anything, just present and carrying an authority that had nothing to do with volume. "We're here on the petition filed by Mr. Samuel Granger regarding the guardianship of Luke and Molly Hale, and the related question of the validity of the marriage between Mr. Jackson Hale and Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore Hale." He looked at the documents in front of him. "The marriage question has been answered. I received the Whitmore estate documentation yesterday afternoon. It's complete, clear, and consistent with Mrs. Hale's testimony. The marriage is valid. That part of Mr. Granger's petition is dismissed. Granger's lawyer made a small movement. Granger himself was still. We're still here, Crane continued, because I have some additional questions, and because I believe a conversation is warranted. He looked at Granger's table. Mr. Granger, I've reviewed the documentation submitted by Mr. Webb regarding your conduct in the Aspen Ridge Valley over the past 2 years. I'd like you to explain to me in plain terms your interest in the property owned by Mr. Jackson Hale. Granger's lawyer stood. Your Honor, my client's business interests. I asked Mr. Granger, Crane said. Same conversational tone. Absolute. The lawyer sat. Granger stood. He was very composed. Jackson had to credit him that. He'd been doing this for 20 years, and he knew how to stand in front of authority without flinching. I've made 3 separate offers to purchase Mr. Hale's Upper Ridge property, Granger said. All legitimate, all refused. I have no dispute with Mr. Hale's right to refuse. Then why? Crane said, looking at a specific page in the file. Did you file the initial report to the county authority regarding the children in Mr. Hale's care? A pause. Brief. Controlled. I was concerned about the children's welfare, Granger said. Crane looked at him over the document. You were concerned, Crane said, about children living with a man you'd been in ongoing property negotiations with, whose land you wanted, and whose legal standing would be significantly complicated by a county investigation. He set the page down. Is that the sequence of events you'd like me to accept? Granger said nothing. Because, Crane continued, what I'm looking at is a pattern, not a single action. A pattern. The county report. The school board action. The affidavit regarding Mrs. Hale's prior estate, an affidavit I'll note that your lawyer filed the same week the Dunn Creek documentation would have been in transit, and therefore unavailable to contradict you in time. He paused. The incident involving your son Dale and the Henley child. The men documented observing the Hale property from the eastern ridge. He looked at Granger with those clear gray eyes. Mr. Granger, I have been on this bench for 12 years. I have seen what harassment looks like when it's dressed in legal paperwork. I know what it costs the people it's aimed at, and I know what it's designed to achieve. He paused. What I'd like to know is whether you're going to tell me you don't know what I'm talking about, or whether we're going to have an honest conversation. The courtroom was very still. Granger's jaw moved. His lawyer leaned toward him. Granger made a small dismissive gesture with his hand that sent the lawyer back. I acted within the law, Granger said. On each individual action, perhaps, Crane said. That is how this works, isn't it? Each individual stone is just a stone. It's only when you look at the pile that you see what's being built. He picked up another page. I'm going to ask Mr. Webb to formally enter the testimony of the following families into the record. The Henley family, Nora Beale, Abraham Marsh, and the Morrison family, each of whom has provided documented accounts of similar pressure applied to their properties and livelihoods by your operation over the past 3 years. He looked at Granger. This matter is being referred to the Territorial Authority for full review. You will receive formal notice within 30 days. I'd strongly suggest that between now and that review, your conduct in the Aspen Ridge Valley reflect an awareness that you are being watched, not from a ridge, by people who answer to the territorial court. Granger's lawyer stood again. Your Honor, this exceeds the scope of the petition. The scope of this bench, Crane said with the first edge Jackson had heard in his voice, is the welfare of the people in this territory, which includes 2 children who have been used as instruments of a property dispute by a man old enough to know better. He looked at the lawyer until the lawyer sat down. Then he looked at Jackson. Mr. Hale, he said, I'd like to speak with your family, all of you. Jackson looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him. They stood, all 4 of them. Crane looked at Luke first. He didn't speak to him like a child, and he didn't speak to him like an adult. He spoke to him like a person. Young man, he said, I understand you wanted to say something today. Luke stood straight. His hands were at his sides. He looked at Judge Crane with those dark, steady eyes, and he said, Yes, sir. Go ahead. Luke breathed in once. Then he spoke. "I know what Granger wants," he said. "He wants the land, and he wants us gone because we make the land harder to get. I know that. I'm 9, and I know that." He paused. "What I want to say is that he keeps talking about us like we're a legal question, like we're something that can be moved around to prove a point." His jaw tightened. "But we're not a legal question. I'm Luke, and she's Molly, and Jackson came to a canyon when nobody else did, and Eleanor stood up when nobody else would, and what we are is a family. It's real. It was hard to get, and it's real, and I'm tired of people who weren't there saying it isn't." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Crane looked at the boy for a long moment. "How long were you in that canyon?" he said. "Before Mr. Hale found you?" "2 days," Luke said. "And how old are you?" "9, sir." Crane was quiet. "Thank you, Luke," he said. Not formally. Like it meant something. He looked at Molly. Molly was holding Eleanor's hand. She'd taken it sometime in the last few minutes, without making a thing of it, and looking at Crane with the big serious eyes of a child who understood that this mattered without entirely understanding why. "Do you have anything you'd like to say?" Crane asked her, gentle, unhurried. Molly thought about it for a moment. Then she reached into Eleanor's bag. She knew exactly where Eleanor had put it, and she pulled out the drawing. The cabin, the pines, the 4 rough shapes. She held it up. "I made this," she said. "It's us." Crane leaned forward slightly. He looked at the drawing. "May I see it?" he said. Molly looked at Eleanor. Eleanor nodded. Molly walked to the bench, steady, deliberate, the way she did things she'd decided to do, and handed the drawing to Judge Arthur Crane of the Territorial Circuit Court of Colorado. He looked at it for what felt like a long time. "This is a good drawing," he said. "Thank you," Molly said. "I made the cabin too big, but Eleanor said that wasn't wrong. She said it just meant I felt safe in it." Something moved in Crane's face. Small, carefully contained, but real. "You can take it back," he said, and handed it down to her. She took it and walked back and pressed herself against Eleanor's side. Crane looked at the room. He looked at Granger, who had not moved, who had been watching this entire exchange with the face of a man who had come prepared for a legal argument, and found himself in something that legal arguments couldn't touch. Crane said, "The custody of Luke and Molly Hale is confirmed in the household of Jackson and Eleanor Hale, effective immediately and without condition. The 90-day review previously ordered by the county is transferred to this court's jurisdiction and will be conducted by a representative I appoint, not a county appointee." He looked at Granger's table. "Mr. Granger's petition is dismissed with a formal notation of bad faith filing. The Territorial Authority review will proceed independently. We're adjourned." He hit the gavel. It was over. Except that it wasn't quite, because Granger stood up on his side of the room and for a moment just looked at Jackson across the space between them, and there was nothing in his face now that was performance or composure. It was something raw. The face of a man confronting the specific unfamiliar experience of having lost genuinely and publicly and not knowing what came next. Jackson looked at him and felt not triumph, not satisfaction, not any of the things he might have expected. What he felt was something closer to pity, and he was surprised by it, and then not surprised because he'd spent 7 years on a mountain learning that bitterness was a weight that never got lighter, no matter how justified it was. Granger looked away first. His lawyer touched his arm. They gathered their papers. They walked out. Dale, who had been sitting in the back of the room, Jackson hadn't noticed him until that moment. A 23-year-old man, sitting alone in the last row watching, stood up and followed his father out. He didn't look at Jackson. He looked at Luke briefly as he passed, and what was in his face then was something Jackson couldn't entirely read. Not malice. Something more complicated than malice. The face of a young man who had been handed his father's way of moving through the world, and was beginning perhaps to notice what it had cost. The door closed. Webb appeared at Jackson's elbow. "That went better than best case," he said. "Crane?" Jackson said. He already knew. He came in knowing. Webb confirmed. The prior matter, the unsealed records, he'd read all of it. He was never going to rule for Granger. What he wanted was to see what Granger would do when put in a room where the usual tools didn't work. He glanced at the bench where Crane had already disappeared through the back door. And he wanted to see you. Did we pass? Eleanor said. Webb looked at Molly's drawing still in Molly's hands. I think, he said, the drawing did most of the work. Molly looked deeply satisfied by this. They were back on the road north by mid-afternoon. The city thinned behind them, and the summer air opened up, and the Rockies came back into view, ahead green and enormous and indifferent to circuit courts and territorial reviews, and the long wars of small men, and Jackson felt something in his chest that he'd been holding compressed for weeks begin finally to release. Beside him, Eleanor rode without speaking for a long time. Luke was ahead with Molly, the two of them in the wagon seat, Molly pointing at things on the roadside, with the narrating enthusiasm she brought to everything, Luke listening, and occasionally responding in the patient older sibling way. What are you thinking? Jackson said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I'm thinking about what Webb said, she said. That Crane came in knowing that the whole thing was as much about watching Granger fail as it was about us succeeding. She paused. I spent 3 months being afraid of a man who'd already overreached. I wish I'd known sooner. You couldn't have known sooner, Jackson said. You just had to move and trust the movement. She looked at him. That sounds like something you learned on a mountain, she said. Most things I know I learned on a mountain, he said. She was quiet for another moment. Then, it's a good mountain. It is, he said. They stopped that evening at the same way station. Same fire. Same stars. Except that it was entirely different because the weight they'd been carrying into Denver was not the weight they were carrying back out of it. And the difference was the difference between a man walking into a fight and a man walking home. Molly fell asleep early against Eleanor's side, the drawing folded in her pocket. Luke stayed up longer, reading by firelight. He'd brought the book because of course he had, and at some point he looked up and said, Webb said the territorial review could take 6 months. He said up to 6 months, Eleanor said. It may be faster. Granger's going to be angry, Luke said. He is, Jackson said. For a while. Is he going to do something else? Jackson looked at this fire. He thought about what Crane had said, that Granger was now being watched by people who answered to the territorial court. That the prior matter was unsealed. That bad faith had been formally noted on a record that was now out of Granger's reach to shape or suppress. He might try something smaller, Jackson said. But his big plays are done. He used them and they didn't work, and now there are eyes on him. He looked at Luke. He's not gone. I won't tell you he is, but he's smaller than he was yesterday. Luke considered this. Good, he said. Then he went back to his book. Eleanor looked at Jackson across the fire. You handled that well today, she said, quietly. All of it. You let Webb do his work. You let Luke say his piece. You didn't try to fill the room. I had nothing to prove to Crane, Jackson said. He already saw it. Most men would have tried to prove it anyway, she said. Most men, Jackson said, haven't had 7 years on a mountain to figure out the difference between what they need to show and what they actually need. Eleanor looked at the fire for a moment. Can I ask you something? She said. You've been asking me things for 3 months, he said. You don't need permission. What do you want? She said. Not for the children, not for the property, for yourself. What does Jackson Hale want when this is all finished, and Granger's quiet, and the 90-day review is done, and the territorial authority has ruled, and there's nothing left to fight? It was, he realized, the first time she'd asked him that. The first time anyone had asked him that in years, maybe. He looked at the fire. I want to stop waking up at 3 a.m. making contingency plans, he said. That'll take time, she said. I know. What else? He was quiet for a moment. He thought about what honest felt like, the specific weight of a truth you'd been keeping in the back of your chest and hadn't said aloud yet. I'd like this to be real, he said. What we are. I know how it started. I know why we did it. but I'd like what we've been doing these 3 months the way it's been between us." He stopped, started again. "I'd like that to be something we chose, not just something that happened to us." Eleanor was very still. She looked at the fire. "I've been thinking about that," she said, "for a while. And I think," she said slowly, "that somewhere between the barn conversation about Granger and the 4 letters and Thomas Webb and Denver, the thing I agreed to in that saloon became the thing I would have agreed to anyway." She paused. "Given the chance." Jackson looked at her. "Given the chance," he said. "Given the chance," she said. And she looked at him directly without flinching the way she did everything. "I would have chosen this. I think I have been choosing it every day since about the 4th morning. I just wasn't ready to say so." The fire crackled. Luke on the other side of it turned a page. "I should have asked sooner," Jackson said. "You asked at the right time," Eleanor said. "The right time is usually when you actually do the thing, not when you think about doing it." A pause. "I've been waiting for you to say it first, because I wasn't entirely sure you—" She stopped. "I was sure," Jackson said. "I wasn't sure it was fair to say so given how we started." "How we started," Eleanor said, "was me standing up in a room full of men who stayed sitting and walking toward something worth walking toward." She paused. "I don't have any regrets about the start." Jackson looked at her for a long moment. The firelight and the stars and Molly asleep and Luke reading and the Rockies somewhere ahead in the dark and the 3 months behind them that had been harder and more real than anything he'd had in 7 years. "Neither do I," he said. She held his gaze. Something settled between them. Not dramatic, not declared, but solid, the way things got when they were genuinely true. The way the mountain was solid. The way the cabin was solid. The way the sound of Luke turning a page was solid. "We should sleep," she said. "We've got 2 days of road." "We do," he said. She didn't move immediately. Neither did he. Then Luke said without looking up from the book, "You two have been talking in a circle for 10 minutes, just so you know." Eleanor made a sound that was entirely unlike her controlled self. A small, involuntary exhale of surprised amusement. Jackson felt something loosen in his chest that had been there for a long time. "Go to sleep, Luke," Eleanor said. "I will in a minute," Luke said, turning another page. "I'm at the good part." They were back on the mountain 4 days after they'd left it. The cabin looked the same. That was the first thing Jackson noticed, that it looked exactly as they'd left it, and that this was not neutral, that the sameness of it was its own kind of statement, because things that had been through what this cabin had been through, and still looked the same, had earned that sameness. Molly ran inside ahead of everyone and immediately put her drawing back on the windowsill next to the wildflower dry now, but still there, still standing because nobody had moved it. She looked at both of them for a moment, like she was confirming something. Then she announced she was hungry. Luke led the horses to the barn without being asked. Eleanor stood in the cabin doorway and looked at the room. The table, the lamp, the curtain, the windowsill with the drawing and the dry wildflower, and she breathed in once deeply and breathed out. "Home," she said. She said it the same way she'd said it on the road to Denver to Molly. Flat and certain. The way she said things she'd decided were true. Jackson came and stood beside her. "Home," he agreed. The territorial review came through 4 months later. Webb sent the summary by post, and Eleanor read it aloud at the breakfast table to Jackson to Luke, who had gone still and careful the way he did when something important was being decided to Molly, who was eating without looking up, and was either not listening or listening very carefully, which with Molly were sometimes the same. Samuel Granger had been formally cited for improper use of county mechanisms for private land acquisition purposes. He'd been assessed a substantial penalty and placed under a 2-year monitoring agreement with the territorial authority. The school board of Aspen Ridge had been reconstituted. The member Granger had controlled had resigned. Roy Casper had been commended specifically for his conduct in the matter, The Henley family received a formal acknowledgement of their complaint. So did Nora Beale. So did Abe Marsh. Eleanor read the last paragraph twice. She set the letter down. "Is it done?" Molly said. "It is," Eleanor said. Molly looked at her plate. "Did we win?" "We did," Jackson said. Molly nodded with great seriousness, as though confirming something she'd been reasonably confident about all along. Then she went back to eating. Luke looked at the letter on the table. He didn't pick it up. He just looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at Jackson, and then he looked at Eleanor, and what was in his face was not the calculated watchfulness that Jackson had first seen in a canyon and had spent 3 months watching soften carefully and at his own pace into something else. What was in his face was simpler than that. What was in his face was just rest, the particular hard-won rest of a person who has been holding themselves ready for disaster for so long that when the disaster finally doesn't come, the body needs a moment to believe it. "Okay," Luke said. One word. But Jackson heard everything in it the 2 days in the canyon. The knife, the long watching, the slow and deliberate and real choosing of trust. And now this, the moment when the ground had proven solid enough to stand on without bracing. "Okay," Jackson said back. Nora Beale threw what she called a modest gathering, which in practice meant half the valley came to the store on a Saturday afternoon, and someone brought a fiddle, and the modest gathering became considerably less modest to mark the resolution of the territorial matter. Eleanor went. Jackson went. Luke allowed himself to be persuaded by the promise of pie. Molly needed no persuasion because Molly never needed persuasion when other human beings were involved. Calvin Henley shook Jackson's hand and didn't say much, which was how Calvin said everything that mattered. His wife Ruth hugged Eleanor briefly with the firmness of a woman who didn't hug often, and meant it when she did. Roy Casper was there looking both proud and embarrassed by the commendation, which was exactly how Roy would look about a thing like that. Nora herself pulled Eleanor aside at some point in the afternoon, and Eleanor came back from that conversation with a look that Jackson associated with information received and processed. "What?" he said. She said, "Eleanor told him that the women in this valley have a meeting every third Tuesday. She said she's been wanting someone who knows how to run a meeting, and would I consider?" "What did you say?" "I said yes," Eleanor said. She paused. "I also said I'd want to include Ruth Henley because Ruth sees everything and says nothing, and people like that are either the most useful person in the room or the most dangerous, and I'd rather have her with us." Jackson looked at her. "You've been thinking about this valley," he said. "I've been thinking about it since the day I arrived," she said. "These people need—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Coordination. They're strong individually and isolated collectively. Granger understood that. He built his whole operation on it." She looked at the room, at the families, at the neighbors who'd spent years standing alone against the same pressure and hadn't known the others were doing the same. "It doesn't have to stay that way." Jackson thought about the woman who had stood up in a saloon. He thought about how she'd walked across that room. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She looked at him. The particular look they'd developed, the one that didn't need finishing. He said, "I'll have the lumber for the expansion ready by fall." She raised an eyebrow. "I didn't say anything about an expansion." "Third Tuesday meetings need a room," he said. "The cabin's not big enough. We'll need to add on." Something in her face went very still for a moment, and then went warm. Not the careful warmth she deployed, but the real kind, the kind she didn't always intend to let out. "You're assuming these meetings will be at our cabin," she said. "Aren't they?" A pause. "Yes," she said. "Probably." Another pause. "That's a large amount of lumber." "I'm good with lumber," he said. She looked at him for another moment. "Jackson Hale," she said with the specificity of someone using a full name to mean something larger than the name itself. "Eleanor Hale," he said back. She shook her head, the small involuntary motion of someone who hasn't quite gotten used to something and is deciding they don't mind. Then she went to go find Molly, who had been missing for 10 minutes, which was either fine or a minor catastrophe depending on Molly's current mood, and Jackson stood in Nora Beale's store on a Saturday afternoon in autumn and watched his wife move through a room full of neighbors and listened to the fiddle and thought about a man who had come down from a mountain in July with blood on his knuckles and said 7 words into a room full of people who'd stayed sitting. He thought about everything those 7 words had started. He thought about Luke across the room, currently engaged in a serious conversation about something with Calvin Henley's oldest boy, 2 children talking with the absorbed intensity of people who have found a subject they both care about. He thought about Molly, who appeared from behind Nora's counter with a piece of pie in each hand, and the expression of someone who had solved a logistical problem elegantly. He thought about Eleanor standing with Ruth Henley, now the 2 of them already in what was clearly the beginning of the kind of conversation that was going to reshape how this valley worked. Because that was what Eleanor did. She walked into rooms, and she changed what was possible in them, and she did it without announcing herself, without asking permission, just by being someone who saw what needed doing and did it. He'd come down that mountain in July with nothing but desperation and a borrowed trust in the possibility that something could still go right. He was going back up it in autumn with a family, not the easy kind. Not the kind that had always been there that came without cost. The kind that had been built in a canyon and a saloon and a courthouse and a way station fire and 4 months of standing together against a man who had believed that wanting something hard enough was the same as deserving it. The kind that knew what it was made of because it had been tested and had held. He looked at that room, at those people, at those children, at that woman, and he knew with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned to distinguish between hope and fact that this was not a thing that was going to be taken from them. Not by Granger, not by courts, not by time. The Hale family had come through the fire, and they were standing on the other side of it, and they were home, and they were staying.